Yes, they.
Does hers work?
Mr. Isa. I'm not recognizing you for questions yet. So, Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss the USAID FY 2024 budget request and explore the myriad of challenges facing the United States and its humanitarian and development professionals around the globe. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. First of all, I want to thank you, Administrator Power, for joining us today. I've really enjoyed working with you over the past 2 years, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in your new role as chairman, and in my new role as chairman. And can I just say it's been a long day, and I've been reading so many of these texts, and sometimes the words just. But I'm glad I'm the chairman and you're the administrator.
I have a few questions for you, sir.
And I don't have a subpoena for you today, so I just wanted to say that as well. So, okay, let's start this whole thing over. USAID is the U.S. government's primary humanitarian and development assistance organization in the world. They are the people who bring food to starving children, bring medicine to the sick and dying, help rebuild schools and bridges and roads when war or natural disasters have washed them away, and we're seeing quite a bit of that today. In other words, Administrator Power, you are the face of America's soft diplomacy, and that's a very important face. We have our hard power with our weapons, this committee deals with, and we have our soft power, and that's your department. So therefore, I think it's critical that USAID have a cohesive strategy to grow America's soft influence while using U.S. taxpayer money effectively and as efficiently as possible. The budget you have submitted to our committee has some good provisions to project American leadership. It does include funding for the Global Fragility Act, legislation that I championed and introduced. This bipartisan program pushes the U.S. government to take a more long-term approach to preventing conflict by looking at its root causes. Unfortunately, though, much of the budget reads more like a wish list rather than a strategic document to promote American leadership through our generosity. The Chinese Communist Party poses a generational threat to the United States of America. I think on both sides of the aisle, and you as well, recognize this. They use the debt trap diplomacy through Belt and Road, broken promises to woo leaders around the world, and to some extent they are succeeding. USAID is one of the primary agencies this government can use to confront the malign influence of the CCP. Yet the president places higher priority on cutting carbon with his request for $11 billion in the climate finance than he does on building much-needed infrastructure in Africa. In fact, I, at the Milken Institute, met with about 12 ministers of finance from Africa and bankers, and I asked all of them, have you worked with the Development Finance Corporation? I know that's not perhaps your direct portfolio, but every one of them, no one raised their hand. In fact, none of them have worked with the DFC. That's maybe another issue for another day. Also, this budget makes it harder, I think, for our partners to do business with USAID by expanding requirements for the so-called DEL. These further slow the pace of USAID's core contract and grant-making business. Budget is also not clear on how USAID plans to spend the requested $400 million for the Countering PRC Influence Fund, and that fund could be a valuable tool to counter the CCP if done correctly as Congress intended. So in short, our foreign aid must serve as a clear alternative to the CCP and our adversaries, while also saving lives and projecting U.S. global leadership around the world. Now I'd like to turn to Afghanistan, where the Biden administration's chaotic and deadly withdrawal left a moral stain on this country and created a massive humanitarian crisis. We know for a fact that taxpayer funding aid is flowing to the Taliban fighters and loyalists rather than suffering Afghan women and children. In fact, the ranking member and I met with some some Afghan women this morning, including Ambassador Roya Rahmani, and we have some thoughts on that, and I'll turn to that when I ask you a question. But the women are hurting, and they're left behind. USAID and the U.S. State Department cannot tell us also exactly how much money is flowing to them, and we need to know that. When you were here in July 2021, I warned that President Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan would limit our ability to conduct oversight of assistance directed there, and I think we're seeing that today. That went forward, and now it's very difficult to track this assistance. At the same time, the Taliban has banned Afghan women from working for the groups dispersing aid in the country. The NGOs can't even hire women because of the Taliban's strict enforcement. And this greatly diminishes the ability to get aid to the women and the children who need them the most. And it further limits our oversight capabilities. The U.S. must adamantly oppose these new rules. We must work with our friends and allies to pressure the Taliban to lift this ban. Hard-fought gains to advance women's rights and promote democracy and stability in Afghanistan were wiped out by President Biden's horrible decision to withdraw unilaterally against the advice of top generals and the intelligence community. So I think it's incumbent upon the president and his top officials like you to fix this problem. Looking at the Western Hemisphere, crisis at our southern borders, you know, is the worst I've seen in my entire career. I believe it's a direct cause and effect from this administration rescinding the migrant protection protocols known as Remain in Mexico. USA plays and must continue to play a critical role in combating the root causes of this migration. And again, going back to DFC, I'd like to see more private investment in Central America to stem the tide and get to the root cause. You know, the U.S. is and has long been the largest foreign aid donor, but we must do this strategically. We can't do this alone. And I think the premise of foreign assistance is that one day we won't have to give foreign assistance once we can stabilize. As the U.S. does more, the Biden administration must urge our partners to step up as well. So again, Administrator Powers, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate what you do. I know you travel a lot. You go into some dangerous hot spots. I know you had a trip planned to go to Africa and the Sudan region, which is war-torn as we speak, and the violence and the killing there is absolutely devastating. And I know you're doing your best to help get assistance to those who need it the most. So with that, Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator Power, for joining us today to discuss President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget request for international affairs and the U.S. Agency for International Development. Administrator, the agency you lead is an indispensable component of the United States national security that is vital to American global leadership. As I've said before, the foreign assistance that the USAID administers is not a handout, but a strategic investment in our future, and I can't think of it being in any better hands and led by you. With all that you have done and accomplished and continue to do, your focus and your dedication is a merit to all of us, and in fact, it is something that leads the world. When you show up, as indicated by the chairman, you go to different places, it shows the very best of America, and I want to thank you for that. The tools also that the USAID has is it safeguards U.S. interests in promoting stability, strengthening democracy, and fostering economic growth, all of which cultivate strong United States partners and directly contributes to our own security and prosperity. A key component of the Biden administration's national security strategy is an emphasis on strategic competition. America simply cannot win this competition without soft power. Victory in this competition will not be defined by military strength alone. It will be about ideas, values, economic development, technology, health, and multilateral systems. This competition is not happening in China or Russia. It's happening, actually, in Latin America, in the Caribbean. It's happening in the Indo-Pacific. It's happening on the continent of Africa. And to win the competition, first and foremost, we need to show up. But leadership is a choice. And unfortunately, the choice that many of my Republican colleagues have made clear is that House Republicans' vision for America's role in the world is not, in fact, leadership, but retreat and isolationism. Now, don't just take my word for it. Let's just read the Republican budget proposals. As House Republicans had it their way, they would slash the U.S. foreign assistance and the budget of USAID by up to 22%, effectively surrendering the high ground to our adversaries who will be more than willing to fill that void. Just check this out. China and Russia aren't slashing their international affairs budgets by nearly 1/3. In fact, they are growing and expanding their foreign assistance programs, wielding them as a means to advance their national interests and exert influence on the global stage. We are losing ground. On the continent of Africa, for example, Russia now has more consulates than we do. We will lose ground. So we simply cannot allow our adversaries and competitors to gain ground and shape the world in their image and to their advantage while we stand idly by. So what do these cuts mean for Bangladesh, where we have seen a dramatic improvement in maternal and child health indicators, and on labor rights, or in Senegal, where our work with smallholder farms through Feed the Future has significantly decreased food insecurity, improved livelihoods, and helped send a generation of girls to school. Beyond how these budget cuts play into the hands of our adversaries, let's also talk about how they will directly hurt the American people. These cuts will damage U.S. economic competitiveness. Our economy is not isolated. In fact, it is deeply integrated into a global marketplace. A reduction in foreign assistance weakens the very countries we rely upon as trading partners, undermining economic stability and inhibiting our ability to expand into new markets. Furthermore, a thriving economy at home requires a prosperous and stable world abroad. These budget cuts are a recipe for global instability. This year, a record 339 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, an increase of more than 25% since just last year. And at a time of unprecedented global humanitarian need, the Republican budget proposal would kneecap U.S. humanitarian operations worldwide, from Sudan to Ukraine to Venezuela, and jeopardize our capacity to respond to new and emerging natural disasters and conflicts. The consequence would be scores of lives lost, mass migration, and a vacuum where terrorists thrive. So if we are serious about global stability, American competitiveness, and promoting American values, we need to fully fund the President's budget request for foreign assistance and provide sufficient resources for the people power that USAID needs. We also need a regular legislative vehicle to update the tools and authorities of USAID. Under my chairmanship in 2021, we passed a State Department authorization bill for the first time in 20 years. We should similarly regularly update the authorities of USAID as we do for other critical agencies responsible for the United States national security. So I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle not to allow this short-sighted and perilous Republican budget proposal to take us backwards. And I urge you to recognize the dangers of standing in place. We need to move forward together to support robust and sustained investment in USAID and other foreign assistance programs. So thank you, Madam Administrator, for your focus on these issues, and I look forward to a productive discussion on how we can work together to strengthen our commitment to the United States global leadership. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Let me just say first to the members on my side of the aisle that the order in which I recognize Republican members today will be different than usual because there were several members who were unable to ask Secretary Blinken questions at our April budget hearing. Therefore, after the ranking member and I ask questions, I will first recognize Republican members at the first row, not the bottom row, the first row of the dais, who were unable to ask Secretary Blinken questions in fairness to you. My first question, what am I saying? Where's my script? Like I said, it's been a very long day. Other members are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have the 19th USAID Administrator, Samantha Powers, before us today. Your full statement will be made part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your remarks as close to 5 minutes as possible. With that, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Meeks, and to all of you for being here today, and to all distinguished members of the committee. Before I start with my prepared statement, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the embassy personnel and escorting police forces in Nigeria who lost their lives yesterday, and to extend my deepest sympathies and, of course, the sympathies of the American people, and I'm sure all of you, to their loved ones who are grieving this devastating loss. Their convoy was brutally attacked while en route to a U.S.-funded distribution of emergency humanitarian assistance to people who were displaced by last year's historic flooding. Other members of the convoy are still missing, and the State Department is working closely with Nigerian authorities to locate them. The individuals who were killed paid a great service to both our country and their own, and they should be remembered as heroes who dedicated their lives to building a better future for the people of Nigeria. I sincerely hope that we can honor their memory, both by holding those responsible, those behind this atrocious act, and by continuing to foster greater peace, prosperity, and stability in Nigeria and beyond. Unfortunately, as you all well know, such violence is not unique to Nigeria, and indeed the decades of development gains that have laid a foundation for an era of relative peace, relative stability, and relative prosperity are at serious risk globally. During our lifetimes, it is wonderful, actually, to behold that the United States has helped accelerate tremendous progress in reducing extreme poverty around the world, in fighting disease, in addressing hunger, getting kids into school, and fueling democracy's rise. But now, many of those very same trends have moved into reverse. The pandemic decimated health systems, leading to a resurgence in diseases from measles to tuberculosis. It also battered many nations' finances. After a decade of heavy borrowing and more recently rising inflation, exacerbated by Putin's war, 60% of the world's poorest countries are at or near debt distress. And natural disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity, leading to a sharp rise in humanitarian needs. The upshot of all of this is stark. For the first time in decades, literally since the late 1950s, human life expectancy is on the decline, while extreme poverty is on the rise. At the same time, democracies everywhere are under attack. Our rivals are using transnational corruption, digital repression, disinformation, and in Ukraine, actual artillery and missile fire to undermine freedom, to elevate autocrats, and to curry favor. A quarter of the world's population face conflict, a rate not seen since World War II, with the horrific violence in Sudan serving as just the latest example. It is a daunting list of challenges, and I know that some, and maybe even some here today, question whether the United States should be taking on these challenges through our development investments, or whether the scope of the challenges is too great to make a meaningful difference. But the fact is, our national security, our prosperity, hinges on this work. Deprivation and indignity abroad can fuel resource competition, political fragility, and extremism that endangers us here at home. Disease outbreaks can cross oceans, as we've seen so recently, and recessions in foreign markets can threaten our own economic growth. If we don't lead efforts to take on these challenges, as the chairman alluded to, and as Ranking Member Meeks did as well, the People's Republic of China and Putin are ready to step in, whether through opaque loans on unfavorable terms or with mercenaries in tow. An international order that values democracy and human rights and respects international borders is not a given. Indeed, authoritarian actors are challenging and aiming to reshape it. We have to invest in the stable and more humane world that we need. USAID is truly privileged to have a leading role in tackling the most significant challenges of our time, in close coordination with our interagency partners advancing diplomacy and defense. And we are grateful to the American people and to you for giving us the resources to make a major difference. That said, we know that to drive progress on the scale that we need in this era, in this moment, we have to bring other countries, the private sector, multilateral institutions, foundations, and local organizations in our partner countries along with us. So USAID has set out a new reform agenda aimed at delivering progress beyond our development programs, using our expertise, our convening power, our advocacy to draw in others, to leverage more resources, to spark innovation, and to inspire broader movements for change. The Biden-Harris administration's FY 2024 request of $32 billion for USAID's fully and partially managed accounts will allow us to make more of that transformative impact. And again, we recognize that we have to use any resources we get as leverage to pull in others. We will invest in countries experiencing democratic openings, helping them show that democracy delivers tangible results for citizens. We will work with nations to attract private sector investment and drive broadly shared economic growth. We'll support countries that are rebuilding their decimated health systems. And we will meet growing humanitarian needs, not just with emergency assistance, but with long-term investments in resilience. And crucially, we will invest in USAID's workforce to carry out this ambitious agenda. Since 2019, because of the state of the world and the generosity of this body, our operating expense funds have increased at half the rate that our programming has grown, giving us more to do with fewer people and resources. So we are incredibly grateful, again, for those plus-ups in programmatic money and resources spent out in the world, but our team and our staffing needs to keep up. This budget that we have proposed for fiscal year 2024 will help us invest in the people and the systems that we need to power an agency that is nimble and responsive. We know that with the United States leading the way, the world can drive meaningful progress against our toughest challenges because we have decades of gains in global health, in education, and in prosperity to prove it. It is on us now to resume that progress. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Administrator Power. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. As I mentioned, we met this morning with Afghan women, leaders in the movement against the Taliban, and it was very powerful testimony that we heard. I worry not only about the American citizens still left behind, the Afghan partners left behind, the interpreters that are now being hunted down by the Taliban. We left our biometrics on them behind, and they go door to door checking biometrics to hunt and kill those that we promised we would protect. But when you get to the women and the girls, it's probably the most depressing thing to see women who have never lived under Sharia law now subjected to this depravity. They can't go to school past sixth grade. They have no rights. They're treated like property. They can't leave the house. And it's really disgraceful. With our assistance going into Afghanistan, and without a presence there, which we don't have, as you know, makes it very difficult to control that situation. But we would like to have some assurance. We're a very generous nation. But the money going in is not going directly to the Taliban, but rather to where it needs to go. And I would say primarily the women and the girls left behind. The NGOs have a very difficult task. I spoke at the Munich Security Conference about this. The idea came up about why can't we condition this aid on assurances from the Taliban that, number one, they will hire women as part of these NGOs to administer the assistance, but they will also give that assistance to women and girls in Afghanistan. It seems to me you got a carrot and stick approach that if they don't do that, then we just simply withhold the funding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for meeting with those women. It's something I do at every occasion I can as well, to be reminded of the human toll that the Taliban regime is exacting on people on the ground. So let me take a few different dimensions of your question. I mean, for starters, on the humanitarian, which is where the bulk of USAID funding goes into Afghanistan, we work only with trusted international partners like the World Food Program, like UNICEF. While the U.S. doesn't have a presence in Afghanistan, as you rightly say, the World Food Program, the UNICEF, all of the major UN agencies still do. Obviously, the Taliban edicts related to UN staff and women working are vastly complicating also what they do and causing them to engage at the highest levels in negotiations with the Taliban to get them to reverse that order. What we're finding on the ground is that compliance with Taliban strictures related to women employees is uneven. And so there are parts of the country where we have been able to work, where our partners have been able to work unimpeded, where women are still staffing those agencies and where women beneficiaries are able to receive services or assistance. But a number of our partners have, in fact, suspended assistance because they have been unable to have basic conditions of humanity and inclusion met. And so I think the latest number I saw is 5 of our 24 partners have had to suspend outright because it's just impossible to work in the way that they need to. With regard to, and I know there's a lot more one can say on that, we have third-party monitoring, we have remote monitoring, we do have safeguards.
Because my time's going to expire, and I
Yes.
want other members to have time.
Yes.
But I can follow up with you. I just think we have, the power of the purse here, and they can either take it or leave it.
I
But
think that the challenge...
They take it under our conditions.
Indeed. Oh, I think that's what our partners, that's
Yeah.
a
And
version of the
my second
attitude
question
they're
really,
taking.
it has to do with the PRC again. DFC has done an inadequate job countering the malign influence, and that's why we created them. And they won't have investments, anything that has to do with energy, fossil fuels. It's got to be all green energy. It's got to have all these different value systems attached to it. And in Africa, it makes any sense. It's not working, is my point. What is U.S. aid doing to counter the Belt and Road Initiative? And I know Amos Hochstein has left the State Department. Who's in charge of that?
Thank you, and I know we're short on time. Amos has moved into actually the White House for a coordinating role on Belt and Road, not on Belt and Road, on the Global Infrastructure Partnership, and I actually just met with him last week, and the ambition around major infrastructure investments in Africa is definitely there. Bringing the private sector, the DFC, the multilateral development banks, of course, is something that has to be done with urgency. You asked about USAID. Virtually everything we do stands in contrast with the Belt and Road model. We are providing technical assistance to governments that are in debt restructuring talks because they've been saddled with so much debt, as you said in your opening statement, by the Chinese. We are working to ensure a non-extractive approach to natural resource development that is in contrast to the extractive approach that the PRC has backed in the past. And all of our support for an open...
My time has expired, but let me just close with, we have certain elements of power here, USAID, DFC, Millennial Challenge Corporation, and we need to coordinate this to effectively counter, because when I talk, and I know the ranking members have this experience, when you talk to the African nations, the ambassadors, and they just say, you're not here. We don't have another alternative. And if we're not there on the field, China will fill that void, and they are, not only in Africa, in that continent, and Indo-Pacific, but in our own hemisphere, I think, here. And I look forward to working with you more on this. And with that, I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. Mr. Powell, I want to do a couple of things real quick, but just following up on the chairman's statement about DFC, I was wondering, one of the things that I've been, I had been fighting for is to make sure that we give the DFC the authorities that it's been asking for, particularly in regards to, and I was supported last term, the equity fix that it was looking at and has requested. And I think that would help it. Just give me a quick, do you think that would help if we were able to fix the equity aspect of it?
I think that the resources that the United States government as a whole has to bring to bear around infrastructure investment are way smaller than they need to be, and that's in part because of the way that scoring is done. It requires an actual appropriation to do things that might be done in a different way. So that's a long-winded answer, but in short, more resources are needed.
So let me ask this, and I'm going to, because I want to get a lot in this short period of time that I have, and I want to make sure that the American people are clear on the impact of the McCarthy Republican budget cut proposals. And so I'm going to just ask a couple of, and then I'll get into a little bit more if I have more time, yes or no questions. Do you believe that the McCarthy budget cuts would damage U.S. competitiveness and our ability to combat the malign influence of China and Russia around the world? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you believe that it is true that the Republican budget cuts would result in at least 80 million fewer people receiving food aid through the Emergency Food Security Program, and that the program could be severely reduced or even eliminated in entire regions, including West Africa, Southern Africa, and Central America? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you believe that the McCarthy Republican budget cuts that slash funding for programs that combat democratic backsliding, support civil society and independent media, counter corruption, and strengthen nascent democracies would benefit authoritarians around the world? Yes or no?
Yes.
And is it true that the Republican McCarthy budget cuts would mean 13 million fewer children being vaccinated, resulting in an estimated 115,000 additional deaths, almost 900,000 children not being reached by essential nutrition services, and the spread of tuberculosis infections to an additional 6 million people, reversing decades of progress and billions in U.S. taxpayer investments in global health? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. So for all of these reasons, the developing world must be at the core of our national security strategy, and particularly on the continent of Africa, which is the youngest and fastest growing region on this planet. Now, I have concerns about what's happening there because, unfortunately, administration after administration has failed to prioritize Africa. And I'm on this bandwagon in a very big way. And as a result, the United States is facing a growing credibility gap on the continent, and our interests are suffering as a result. Now, I know and appreciate President Biden's work to organize the United States-Africa Leaders Summit in December, but symmetry and rhetoric and high-level visits, for me, are not sufficient. So, Administrator Powell, as a member of the Biden National Security Council, can you tell us what actions are you able to, or are you taking to ensure that Africa is a priority for the Biden administration?
Well, I think you know better than most, having seen some of these programs on the ground, the impact that, for example, PEPFAR, our malaria work, our anti-TB work, all of the work in the global health space, the work not only distributing vaccines, but getting shots in arms in COVID, where we worked with, for example, Zambia to go from 15% coverage to 84% coverage over the course of a year. While the headlines are not capturing African vaccination rates, tremendous impact there of U.S. investments. So I think you see that visibly. What's exciting about the Africa Leaders Summit, Prosper Africa, where you've been very involved, is the diaspora communities, the private sector, and the enthusiasm for investment on the ground. USAID's piece of this right now is rather modest, but it's indispensable, which is how do you create a regulatory environment such that American businesses are going to want to make those investments, such that these big infrastructure projects can go forward. What China does is they do 9-to-1 loan to grant. What the United States does is we do 9-to-1 grant to loan. But complementing, using those grants catalytically, and then bringing in over the top the World Bank, the other big infrastructure players, African private sector actors as well, that's where you're going to see the kind of visible infrastructure impact along the lines of what I think some of these leaders are hungering for.
I'm out of time, and thank you, but I just want you to know, Madam Administrator, that I am focused on making sure that we are investing on the continent of Africa, doing the kinds of infrastructure projects that needs to be taking place. We need to give the equity to the DFC so that we can get and invest and work with the African Development Bank and others there. There's a lot of work we need to do for our own national security interests. For my recent visit to Ghana and talking to other nations and other ambassadors and other heads of states on the continent. So I thank you for your work, and I know where you're headed, and you're doing the hard work. But I appreciate you. Thank you, Mr.
Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Self.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I think our entire budget should be both in hard and soft power should be dedicated to the interests of our national interest. Frankly, my perspective will be informed by a decade overseas, both in the third world, in the developed world, in the Pentagon, and to include over a decade in joint headquarters. And those are awfully noble words, but as I look at this list of countries that was in our read-ahead packet, many of these countries, if not failed states, are near failed states. Speaking of Africa, Africa has had trillions of dollars poured into it over the last decades. And when I look at this list, many of these are even in the Iranian satellites. I was in Afghanistan when the ground command was still in a tent. The dust was still 6 inches thick, and it has not changed. It is a nation of tribes. We must understand that Afghanistan is a nation of tribes. I want to prioritize this entire budget along in a dangerous world. China is on the prowl. We do not have a lot of time, so soft power is predicated on time. And I will tell you that when I think back to the Cold War, the Russians were 10 feet tall at the time. They were moving around the world, and frankly, we determined because we built up our military and we turned them into a paper tiger. Our time is short. China has demographic issues. They have a command economy now. They're going to have issues in the near term, but that makes them very dangerous in the near term because they know their window is short. I think that we ought to prioritize this entire budget toward hard power. The Economist said that we could save $32 cents on every dollar by shifting resources away from the traditional contractors to more in-country partners, which means to me that I think we probably ought to relook this entire budget and take 32% of it and turn it into the defense industrial base. So I am asking this committee to look at what we need to do to deter China. Our first mission is to deter. Development is great, development is fine, but again, our first mission is to deter. And I would appreciate any comments, Administrator Powers, on that, because we will have to prioritize in this constrained budget environment. Our priority must be to the short term, because we have decimated our military to the degree that I think we have no choice.
Thank you, and above all, thank you for your service in so many different roles. I'm tempted to just take the select quote of what you said, which is development is great. But I won't. Because I hear the spirit of the question. So first to say, it absolutely goes without saying that nothing that I'm proposing here should come at the expense of the appropriate investments in our defense and in the competition that we are in with the PRC globally. Indeed, if you look at this request, when looked at in isolation, it may look like a large number. When looked at juxtaposed next to the Defense Department's budget request, and I hope what will be delivered upon, you will see this is a very, very small price to pay to complement defense expenditures. When we're looking at the choices that countries are making about whether, for example, to have a PRC base in their country or a deep water port or something that has, I'm sure you and I would agree, has significant geostrategic consequence, there are a lot of factors that go into that decision-making on their part, and how they feel about the United States, how their people feel about the United States, whether we have been there for them, when a hurricane hits, or to support, small business owners with a tiny little microfinance
I have 30
loan.
seconds. May I ask one more question?
Please.
I think history has shown that most of the world admires one thing, to include China, to include Russia, to include most of the world. They admire strength. I think that's why today we lack admiration around the world, which is what you're describing. You're not putting it in those terms, but that's what you're describing, and my time is up. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Sherman.
I want to commend the chair for selection of the title of this hearing, which illustrates how our foreign aid budget is an important part of our geopolitical efforts and geostrategic efforts. I agree with the ranking member that in addition to aid, we need to focus on diplomacy and consulates. And I would add that the visa process delays do probably more harm to our image in the world than anything else that isn't covered in the news. It undermines our ability to trade, do business deals, cultural, et cetera, and it's just a matter of not processing paperwork quickly. We spend 0.2% of our GDP on aid. Other wealthy countries as a group average 0.4%, so we're at half the level. And unfortunately, Republicans are proposing to slash that by almost a quarter. I'm glad that we've talked a little bit about China's efforts. There are those who view China as doing a lot in the foreign aid area, but as you point out, it's 9/10 loan. Little interest on that loan eats up the last tenth. And of course, China, in competing with us for foreign influence, has the option of giving bribes, which I think they do effectively and which we disclose way too rarely. The ranking member points out the importance of Africa. I want to focus on Tigray. We've suspended our food aid to an area where 5 of the 6 million people are dependent on food aid. The UN has done the same, and that is because there has been diversion, apparently by both sides, in the recently concluded civil war. We need humanitarian monitors on the ground in Tigray because not only does truth die in the darkness, women and children die in the darkness. And also that monitoring, having people on the ground, will allow us to give out the food aid without it being diverted to an undue degree. Ms. Powers, do you have the clout inside the administration to make sure that we're not reauthorizing AGOA, that we're not backing the international lending that Abiy wants, until we can get our humanitarian monitors and food distribution people onto the ground in Tigray?
Well, first, I think I have to put on record a condemnation on behalf of USAID, but also on behalf of the American people for the diversion of aid when you have more than 5 million people who are facing famine-like conditions. Just outrageous. And yes, we have paused, I think, as faithful stewards of the resources given to us. When you get word of something of that nature, pausing and figuring out how to get the access that you need on the ground, the systems in place. We have them all around the world. This is a very rare
If we don't have
occurrence.
people on the ground, we won't get it done. Can you hold up AGOA and international lending until Abiy lets our people onto the ground?
I am a member, as you noted in your question, a member of an interagency team, and needless to say, this is an absolutely critical factor, as is getting human rights monitors on the ground to monitor the treatment of the people
I do
of
want to
Tigray as well.
move to another question. We've got a blockade of Artsakh, part of an effort to ethnically cleanse the area. People need food aid. Does this area meet the U.S. AID's definition of a crisis, and what can you do to provide aid to the people of Artsakh?
Well, the major implementing partner now that has been able to get in to Nagorno-Karabakh are ICRC, which is funded actually by the State Department, but the U.S. is the largest donor to ICRC. A convoy, in fact, just finally moved before this hearing, just as we were coming in. But what I will say is that Nagorno-Karabakh shouldn't have to rely on humanitarian convoys. Again, prior to late last year, you had commercial traffic moving freely into the area. So it's absolutely imperative that the roads into
Our
Nagorno-Karabakh be
ambassador
opened.
was there at the road to demonstrate our dedication on that. Finally, we have the Pacific Islands. My father fought for those islands, as did others here, because of their geostrategic importance. They control much of the world's land, surface area, much of it underwater. China's making a play in that area. What can we do to secure our relationship among these lightly populated but strategic islands?
Well, you'll see a significant increase in the resource requests for our programming in that region. I will be traveling to the country of Fiji later this summer to open a USAID mission in Fiji. We haven't had a mission there since 1994. And I think it's in keeping with a point that's been made by others about the importance of presence, but also the programming and the soft power and the other forms of power that come with actually making those investments and the people seeing that. We will also have a country representative in Papua New Guinea, and by 2025, we will have 51 staff across the region, which is
I hope you'll focus
important.
on the smallest and least populated of the countries there, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Power, we understand that USAID OIG has recently been focused on strengthening access to the UN agency records relating to USAID funded programs. More access furthers the OIG's efforts to hold the UN officials accountable for misusing USAID funds or committing sexual atrocities against program beneficiaries. There is language in the relevant agreements contractually obligating UN compliance with OIG requests for information, but will you commit to ensuring that the USAID OIG is able to obtain the information from UN agencies it deems necessary to conduct its independent oversight work?
I'm unaware that there's an issue in any compliance with USAID OIG requests, so your question puzzles me a little bit, but we have a constant flow of information. Without knowing the specifics, I wouldn't want to generalize, but we are mandated to cooperate with USAID OIG. We have many open requests and audit recommendations that we are working on as we speak, so I absolutely commit to cooperating further.
Great. I hear the commitment to cooperating and ensuring that USAID OIG is able to obtain that information. I also understand that USAID's Office of Inspector General has informed USAID that its lack of pre-award certification language requiring prospective awardees to disclose past engagements with entities sanctioned for corrupt activity and human rights abuses creates significant vulnerabilities. And also, USAID OIG has flagged that the lack of form selection clauses in USAID's award agreements prevents the U.S. government from bringing suit in U.S. courts against foreign NGOs alleged to have misused USAID funds. Can you address those issues and explain why the agency has failed to take those steps?
Again, I can't, knowing how important compliance is and the rooting out of fraud, waste, and abuse in our programming, we do everything in our power, and also the importance of the integrity of our partners, including on corruption grounds or any link to extremism or to terrorism. So the specifics of what you're describing in that recommendation, I'd want to just work at a staff level, and I can follow up with you personally when I understand exactly to what you're referring. But again, the relationship, if you, some here may have attended there was a hearing just a week or two ago where our OIG testified on Afghanistan and assured, again, that she and the team were getting full cooperation and full access. Same on Ukraine. I think there was an OIG hearing not long ago on Ukraine. So I'd want to know the specifics again of where you're hearing a complaint or some lack of cooperation.
Thank you, and I appreciate the follow-up. Really, the second question relates to contractual language, and so in particular, the disclosure requirements in the contracts and also the form selection clauses. Those are the two issues from the contractual standpoint that I'd like for you to look at and get back to
Absolutely.
me about.
Yep.
When you guys at USAID begin to look at the priorities for each of the expenditures you have and the budget requests each year, tell me in your words, what are those priorities that you would list?
Well,
Shortly, by the way.
yeah, that's not my strong suit, as you can tell. You may not be aware, but we are 90% earmarked. So I wish we had the luxury of sitting down with all of you and laying out what our priorities are and how they should be implemented. Obviously, in the wake of a pandemic that has taken millions of lives, we have a global health priority, including global health security, making sure that countries in which we work have the systems to detect viruses before they become what they became in the case of COVID. Helping countries transition to clean energy, but more urgent for most of the countries in which we're working is adapting to changing weather patterns, which are undermining their agricultural and other gains.
I presume that when you're looking at a lot of these different projects or countries that are possible to help or assist with, that you don't have enough money in your terms to provide the assistance to all the different projects, all the countries. Is that correct?
Absolutely have to be very selective.
Do you
Yeah.
take into account national security interests when you decide which particular projects to recommend funding?
It really depends on what domain we are talking about. Our humanitarian assistance, for example, because it goes to people who are at risk of famine, that's needs-based. When we are, looking at strengthening a relationship, we're part of the interagency. If there's some strategic imperative, we've talked about USAID programming generally, standing in contrast to how the PRC is doing its business. In the exchange I had with your colleague, recognizing, I think, that USAID actually helps open up doors. We're the ground game, in fact, to that strategic competition in some sense. So it really depends on the circumstance, but I'd be happy to sit down with you and we could talk about particular regions or countries of interest.
Thank you, and I know my time's up, and I'm going to yield back, but I just want to say I would hope that if all things are equal, that national security interests would tip the scale in favor of those countries and projects that meet our national security interests. But thank you for your time.
If I could just say one more thing, which is President Biden is the first president to actually make the USAID administrator a member of the National Security Council for this reason, believing that development, diplomacy, and defense have to be coordinated and channeled in areas of national security importance, and also recognizing, again, to the prior exchange, the criticality of development to our national security on, for example, issues like global health security.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Ms. Administrative Power. And our deep sympathy goes out to all of those who were affected by the tragedy in Nigeria and to the greater AID family. I'd like to first of all, I want to thank you for your leadership. I have known most of the AID administrators for the last 40-something years. I think you're one of the most outstanding, if not the most outstanding. You've been willing to spend political capital. You rolled up your sleeves and helped us pass the Global Health Security Bill, and you weren't shy about protecting, the right provisions to make sure that we got good law into law. And I thank you for that. That shows great leadership that not everybody who preceded you has shown. Thank you so much for your leadership. I want to follow up on the line of questioning of the ranking member and maybe go into programmatic impacts of the hostage-taking debt ceiling bill passed by the Republican majority that requires draconian, if not reckless, budget cuts all across the federal government, and certainly a significant budget cut potentially for AID. The emergency food program, you help 36 million people a year, $1.8 billion. What would a 22% cut do to that?
It would mean hundreds of thousands of farmers would not get access to seeds, female farmers not get access to microfinance, and most frustratingly, we would probably end up in a situation of coming back and appealing for emergency aid when what communities most want is to be, as the chairman was saying earlier, resilient and self-reliant, not dependent on handouts. So the sort of ethos I think that we all embrace here of the importance of people being able to fend for themselves and to close USAID missions, which is our ultimate objective, we set that back when we move away from our core food security programs that are all about them having the agricultural productivity.
Almost seems self-defeating given the common views we all share about trying to help people get on their feet and be able to then sustain their own growth and development. Maternal and child health care, there'd be a $20 million cut in that program. What would that do?
Well, you'd have about 19,000 maternal and newborn child deaths that you wouldn't have if we could just preserve our funding from this year. And additionally, 13 million fewer kids vaccinated, because that's the chapeau under which we do childhood immunization. So that would be devastating.
So life and death kind of issue.
Indeed.
The malaria initiative, another $20 million cut. What would that do?
4 million children with malaria would not be treated, and you'd see a dramatic cut in the number of bed nets that we could put out where you can actually prevent people from dying from a mosquito bite.
And the irony as well as tragedy of that is we're actually making progress in malaria in terms of both prevention and maybe even a cure. Is that correct?
It is, and we have also the changing malaria patterns because of climate change and so forth, wanting to keep up with that and not lose these gains that we have made where some whole areas are declared malaria-free. We want to be in a position to be preventive in areas where malaria may be migrating.
TB, tuberculosis, which we know is a stubborn phenomenon, even though it's potentially curable. We also know there are resistant strains that we're very worried about with the spread of TB if we don't control it. What would a $23.5 million cut to the TB program do?
6 million more infections and about 350,000 more deaths.
And possibly continued transmutation of the bacterium that
Indeed.
could be resistant to treatment.
Yes.
Tropical diseases, be a $7 million reduction in funding for tropical diseases. Why is that important?
Well, we leverage that $7 million, and we have the private sector actually giving the medicines away and USAID doing the distribution. So that $7 million investment, allows us actually to eliminate neglected diseases in countries, as we just did this week in Mali, and at such a minimal cost to the taxpayer, and again, bringing the private sector in ways that are free for the American people.
Things like schistosomiasis, which we've almost eradicated.
Indeed.
Final point, Mr. Chairman, I just think we're shooting ourselves in the foot with these kinds of cuts, especially if, on a bipartisan basis, as we've expressed, we're concerned about growing Chinese influence. Why would we create a vacuum for them to step into? I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a emergency medicine physician, I think it's important to address, and I have some statements I just going to set aside for just a second because we just got done talking about global health. We just talked about the spread of diseases. Most people don't realize that when Mr. Conley was bringing up tuberculosis and other contagious diseases, the most deadly disease over the last decade is tuberculosis. About 1.7 billion people are affected with it right now. Some estimates, the CDC said, I'm not sure if I trust all the CDC's data, but it says about 23% of the world population has been exposed to or has some sort of TB infection, most of it latent, of course, and about 1.5 million people die of TB every year. So it is a problem. And as a matter of fact, we're right next to a nation that has a moderate amount of infection, Mexico. They also have a whole bunch of other diseases that we don't have here in America until now. I just want to point out the hypocrisy that a party that talks about controlling disease and rants and rails about the money we have to spend combating these diseases has a wide open border policy that allows diseases into our own country that we have to combat. That's a deadly disease, the most deadly contagious disease in the world. So when I hear the people on the other side ranting and railing about health and spending, we are going to increase our health spending and decrease our health by not controlling the spread of diseases. It used to be most people don't realize this, historically, used to test people for glaucoma because we didn't know how it was spread or we didn't know if it was a contagious disease. We were very strict on the people we allowed in America, historically, for a reason. We've forgotten that. We've forgot it during the most deadly pandemic we had recently, which is COVID. We had open border policies. Meanwhile, we're lectured by the other side on how we should wear masks and how we should be locked down and close our businesses, and yet we brought people across the border and disseminated them all over the United States during the most contagious, deadly disease we've ever had in American history in recent times. So it just struck a nerve with me as an emergency medicine doctor who worked countless ER shifts at nighttime during this pandemic, the hypocrisy of being accused of not being concerned about health care. I put my life on the line. I was on the front lines. I suffered the consequences of this disease when I held people's hands as they died, as I prayed over them, as I watched families who couldn't even get in and see their families as their family members died. So I think it's a bit outrageous to start talking about responsibility and disease processes. With that, I'll get back to my current tirade, because that's a nerve that you struck with me. I'm deeply concerned about the violence in Nigeria as well, by the way. I spent a lot of time in Africa, a couple tours over there with the military as a Marine. I spent months away from my family, and I understand that we have an accountability problem, and we have a significant problem with violence over there against our own folks, which I'm deeply concerned about, and I think some of that comes from the foreign policy weaknesses that are perceived by our current administration. I'm worried that we'll put more people in jeopardy by a perception that we just won't stand for what we're supposed to stand for, and that we don't have the military that can really be out there in a Marine expeditionary capacity because we have a shortage of ships and, quite frankly, even the ability to project our power like we used to. When it comes to you, I really want to give you time because I don't have time. I'm sorry about the distraction. Once again, it hit a nerve with me. But transparency for the government is really important for all of us. I think we'd all agree on that. When you were confirmed 2 years ago and you pledged to make reforms to the agency, from my understanding, you made a promise about changes and transparency, but I haven't seen your promised list of changes. Are you ready to publish that as far as changes from when you took over to where you're at right now, and what you intend to do to make sure that we're transparent in all the monies that we spend?
Again, I'm not sure if you're talking about transparency related to awards that USAID gives in the world, transparency to how we hire people, but any aspect of that, I'm absolutely happy to engage on. I mean, I'd want you to, if you could be specific about what you want insight into, we're here.
And I'm not accusing you of anything, by the way. This is not a confrontational statement. It's more of we went through kind of how when you took over and you're in your present capacity, we were just talking, and I know I'm out of time, but we'll talk more. I'm looking forward to work with you, working to see how you're reforming and making sure that we have really good transparency so we can move into the future as we're doing what we're supposed to do around the world. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Administrator Power. When I heard the ranking member detail the effects of the McCarthy budget cuts, I was reminded of a former Republican-appointed Secretary of State, Jim Mattis, and who's quoted as saying, if we don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. And nothing underscores this more now, and nothing's more dramatic than your work in Ukraine and the surrounding areas as a result of Putin's illegal war. And I want to thank you because that's an area of my concern as former chair and now ranking member in Europe, for your tireless effort in support of the people of Ukraine in their fight for freedom. I know that you had to overcome amazing security and logistical hurdles just to operate in and around that area. And it wasn't easy. It was risky. And I want to thank the whole department for their efforts. It's truly heroic work. And that's just not dealing with people in Ukraine, but the refugees that are coming to places like Poland and Moldova. Because in Ukraine, you know, the war exists beyond the front line over there right now. And I think that's important to remember that now, not later on, because just as the hot war is being waged, these other conflicts are going to have to be dealt with now, or the whole war will be for naught. We have to make sure, as those soldiers in the front line who so courageously are risking their lives, seeing their homes just blown out from under them, their families move, we have to make sure there's health institutions in place and that they remain open. We have to make sure first responders meet the emergency medical needs that are necessary. And we have to make sure children that are going through all this trauma can at least continue their education. Without that kind of support and assistance, those fighters will not be able to fight on the front line. And you know, we have to think now, not later, about what's going to happen when the war ends. Because that's critical. You're going to have one of the strongest military powers in all of Europe, in Ukraine, all that modern equipment, all that training, all those military assets are going to exist in Ukraine. And if we don't maintain, as the work you're doing now, working for democracy and maintaining support for civil servants, making sure government works every day, making sure that at the end of this war it doesn't collapse again and create an enormous problem for all of us, and a situation where all that bloodshed and treasure was in vain. And along those lines, too, I also want to, the important work giving assistance to making the Russians accountable for their war crimes and what they commit continues to be important. We've got to continue and expand those efforts of assistance as well. This committee moved out a bill I've worked on in bipartisan fashion yesterday for a special tribunal on the crime of aggression. So we're moving in a bipartisan sense on that. But I want to just touch on other areas of Europe in terms of promoting democracy, preserving democratic institutions and governments in that region, because I just want to point out a couple of areas where there's some democratic backsliding that concern me. One is Hungary, where the actions there are co-opting the rule of law and violate minority rights and are coddling up to Russia and China right now. In Georgia, where efforts to pass a Russian-style foreign agent registration law was a concern. And in Turkey, where they're slowly drifting towards authoritarianism there. And a more encouraging note, thank you for the work in Northern Ireland. You know, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. There's still work to be done, but the work that's being done there through the Ireland Fund and other things, preserving a peaceful environment and moving forward. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to demonstrate how important, I don't even like the term soft power sometimes, because it appears soft. It should be, it should have another term. But without the work you're doing, we won't have the ability, in terms of our own security needs, to meet these challenges and, importantly, to make them successful. So thank you for your work, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Mills.
Really quickly, thank you, Mr. Chair. On what my colleague, Mr. McCormick, said, he was talking about whether or not you believed in transparency. You said, I do, but I need to talk about specifications. I'm very happy to talk about specifications. And I'd really like to talk about the fact that the special investigator for the General for Afghanistan, SIGAR, John Sopko, had mentioned that U.S. aid was not in full compliance with SIGAR's oversight efforts to the tune of billions of taxpayers' dollars being spent in Afghanistan. Why is it that U.S. aid has been obstructing SIGAR's work in Afghanistan?
We have not been obstructing SIGAR's work in Afghanistan, quite the contrary.
So Sopko is lying then, is what you're stating?
We are not obstructing SIGAR's work, and so if I could finish and elaborate. There is a question, since it is the SIGAR for reconstruction, and the statute makes clear that once you're under $250 million in reconstruction, jurisdiction for such a SIGAR, as it did for Iraq, would recede, right, except for legacy reconstruction oversight that would be done. So there was a question of jurisdiction, but even as we asked those questions and engaged on the modalities, we continued to cooperate. And indeed, right now we're working on 6 requests for information, 26 financial audits, and 68 open audit recommendations with SIGAR. We have
really quickly,
extensive working level and
right, just really
high-level
quickly, you said that
context.
anything under $250 million.
That's in the statute. I'd leave that
Because
to
that's
your
interesting,
staff.
because, you know, I used to work on some of these implementing for-profit partners for about 6 months till I realized that cash diplomacy was a complete failure in many efforts. And I had worked on a program that SIGAR had actually provided an investigation on in November of 2011 called ASI South, which is an OTI program, whereby they showed that the Afghan Stabilization Initiative, which in many cases would fall under that $250 million threshold you just talked about, had failed multiple times.
I think, sorry, maybe I misspoke or you misheard. I was not talking, SIGAR, when it has jurisdiction over what we do, has jurisdiction over everything. What I'm talking about is the statute, which says that that office comes into existence with its staff and its resources when more than $250 million is being expended by the U.S. government in reconstruction. So since we're no longer doing any reconstruction, there was a legitimate question by the lawyers and others about whether we should revert to the situation where only the U.S. Aid Inspector General or the State Department Inspector General is doing their work, because that work has continued alongside SIGAR's throughout the period. And as you know from the hearing, perhaps, our U.S. Aid Inspector General testified that there was absolutely no issue with cooperation, and so we're now cooperating with both at the same time.
Speaking on cooperation, you know, Mr. Sopko also further testified in April that USAID nor the State Department can identify how much U.S. assistance in Afghanistan actually gone to the Taliban in taxes, fees, bills, rents, and other expenses. Why is your office unable to identify how much money your administration is paying directly to the Taliban?
Well, this is actually something that we're in touch with both our own Inspector General and SIGAR on. It's something that every day as we expend resources, there's a question. We do not provide resources to the Taliban. We do not work through the Taliban. But it's true that when the World Food Program works in Afghanistan to feed hungry people, they do pay for example, electricity. So we have to dig into those kinds of expenses in a systematic
will you then
way.
confirm, at least affirmatively commit to providing my office and this committee then with an itemized list of expenses paid to the Taliban for taxes, fees, bills, rent, and other expenses?
We will commit to looking at this question together. It is
But you won't commit to submitting it to our office and to our committee?
to a specified list of what electricity
Correct.
bills are
Goes
paid in
towards
what
the
places.
Taliban.
I think I commit to working with you to make sure that you get the accountability that is
Got it.
appropriate. Thank you.
So continuing on with this, you know, as part of the mindset for the USAID, did USAID provide any after-action reviews with regards to the Afghan withdrawal?
We did. We did a kind of a hot wash, particularly on the question of the evacuation, given how many of our staff were vulnerable. We have 123 Afghan staff, all of whom wanted to leave, have eventually made it to the United States, but it was very difficult, of course.
Well, I'm very aware of that, given the fact that I'm only a member of Congress who actually went over there and conducted rescues of Americans left behind by the Biden administration. I wanted to go on that. So if yes, you have actually done that, will USAID provide its after-action review to this committee?
Again, this is the kind of thing we will engage with your staff and look at what can be provided.
You know, it's just funny to me. You know, both Secretary Blinken from the State Department, as well as for yourself, Administrative Power, not only did you show up late to this, but you're actually asking for $32 billion in requested funding, and yet you're giving us a hard stop time at 5 p.m. because You don't want to actually allow us to be able to ask for the questions of every single member of this committee who has a right to ask those questions before we're appropriating $32 billion of taxpayers' money. As legislators, we are stewards of the taxpayers' money. And so the fact that you're actually not even willing to stay here to have every member of this actual body be able to ask you questions, what is so important that you can come in here and ask for $32 billion but not afford every member of this esteemed committee to be able to ask these questions?
So first of all, I was on time for the hearing. Just let the record show. We had an engagement with the chairman and the ranking beforehand, so apologies if it got started late. And while I can't make public the reasons that that I need to leave at 5 p.m., I'm happy to follow up with you later this evening and explain.
Gentleman's
Thank you.
time has expired.
I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Representative Cicilline.
Thank you, Ambassador Power. It's great to see you, and thank you for your extraordinary service to our country. You know, our colleagues sometimes may not fully appreciate that we are making our constituents safer by addressing the root causes of conflict and violent extremism and promoting stability by reducing poverty, cultivating freedom and democracy, and stemming migration, which of course is the central part of your work. There was even a suggestion made if we just spend more money on defense, which currently we spend $816 billion on diplomacy and development, about $78 billion, so about a tenth of it. And so I think this notion of if we would just spend more on defense and less on diplomacy and development misses the mark significantly, and I know you have made that point throughout this hearing. I want to just quickly turn to one issue, and that is both Senator Baldwin and I worked very hard to increase funding to protect LGBTQI people around the world, and particularly we're successful including a historic $25 million for USAID's Inclusive Development Hub protection of LGBTQI plus persons. Can you just confirm that that money is in fact being appropriated to LGBTQI plus groups working on inclusive development programs around the world? Because I know there's been some question raised as to whether all of that is actually going to that effort. And I'm happy to follow up with you if, okay.
I wasn't aware the questions were being raised. I mean, there are an array, as we look at inclusive development, there are an array of groups that we're seeking to work with who are marginalized and persecuted because of status or lack of status. So maybe we can just follow up and look at the disaggregation, but thank you for your leadership in securing those resources.
No, thank you. In 2023, a record 339 million people rely on humanitarian assistance and protection, an increase of more than 25% since last year. You have, in fact, proposed an increase to meet that obligation or that need. And I'm just wondering if you would comment on what would be the consequences of not only not responding to that increase, but a 22% cut in that funding.
Thank you.
Which the Republicans have proposed.
Let me be brief, but just start by saying that as humanitarian needs exploded, and they've been steadily exploding, but last year, the worst year in recorded memory, the Ukraine supplementals ended up absolutely pivotal. They brought in, and it brought to the United States on behalf of the American people, an additional nearly $5 billion on top of our base budget. Every penny of that was obligated and was expended and was needed, whether in Afghanistan or in the Horn of Africa where there was unprecedented famine, or even when a hurricane hits in our own hemisphere for Venezuelan refugees and others. So, you know, we are in a different situation this year where, as of now at least, we don't have additional supplemental resources being brought in. So already we are looking at a very substantial diminishment, even as with the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, with the new crisis in Sudan compounding the previous crisis, needs are going to be much, much higher this year than last. And so if you cut on top of our base, on top of not bringing in, again, those supplemental resources, it'll mean whole countries will basically have no access to food assistance, and that would be devastating. It'll mean, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives likely lost.
Democracy has consistently proved to be the most reliable geopolitical allies and trading partners for our country, and they outperform non-democracies in delivering prosperity, stability, and good governance. Unfortunately, by some measures, democracies have declined for 15 consecutive years, and fewer than a fifth of the world's people now live in fully free countries. Would you just speak a little bit to USAID's efforts to modernize its tools of democracy assistance to address emerging threats such as digital repression, weaponized corruption, election meddling, disinformation, and attacks on independent media, and how that work would be impacted by the Republicans' action to cut USAID's democracy, rights, and governance agenda by 22%?
Well, over the more than decade and a half that by most indicators, democracy has been on its back heel and backsliding has been increasing. Investments by the United States in standing up for civil society, independent media, and open digital infrastructure, standing against corruption, those investments have been steadily decreasing. So the state of democracy has been decreasing, as have our investments in contesting that. I think that's finally being reversed. There's finally a realization that we need to fight back against some of these trends that our geopolitical rivals who believe in a different system are fighting back. So we are modernizing the toolkit alongside the traditional tools like those I've just mentioned, supporting independent media, civil society, election monitors, and the like. We're creating a new insurance fund to protect journalists from lawsuits. We're bringing about economic dividends in places where there are reform openings, which I think is really important, that when you have a reformer who's swept into office, either out of popular protest or an election change, for the United States to be there in a visible way with programs that matter in the lives of ordinary people, bread and butter programs. So linking our development, our economic development and agricultural health and other work with our democracy promotion agenda, I think, is a part of that vision. And when we're finally getting back to being at the table and fighting to cut those resources, again, would be immensely harmful at just the time you actually see the smallest net decrease in democratic indicators globally in 17 years. So finally, there's about to be a level playing field. That would be the worst possible time, and it would be the best thing we could do for the PRC's ambition, which is to see those autocratic movements grow.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Lawler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Powers, incitement and the promotion of hatred within the Palestinian schools has been widely documented. What steps has the administration taken to press the Palestinian Authority to improve its educational materials, and how are we ensuring USAID partners do not promote incitement?
Well, obviously we strongly condemn and disavow any messages that promote hate, whether in a textbook or in the public sphere. I think what you're referring to is the UNRWA programming, which is usually where this textbook issue arises. That is something that is funded out of the State Department, but the programs that we fund through the Middle East Partnership program are meant at bringing communities together so as to humanize each other, so that those kinds of sentiments are also fought in a different way. So in terms of engagement with the education system, USAID, to my knowledge, doesn't have programming now of that nature, but again, we try to foster as much cross-line cooperation as we can so as to diminish that sentiment.
And you're confident that our partners are not doing that?
There are implementing partners. Well, I mean, we have what in any instance where you have any link to extremism or very problematic actions of that nature, of the nature that you're describing, for people to bring those forward and for us to be able to engage. I mean, we have systems meant to choose partners who share our values. And so on the front end, I think our systems—
Right, but are you confident that our partners are not doing that?
That they're not doing what? Something with textbooks specifically, or
yeah, that they are partaking in helping promote incitement within Palestine with respect to the school system there. Are you confident that U.S. taxpayer dollars at your disposal, working with our partners, are not being used to foster that incitement? Yes or no?
In the education system, I'm confident that, but USAID is not working again in education programming. What we do when we, in any appeal, whether on sanitation or on health, we look and do full due diligence in a manner to root out the risk of that.
This past weekend, I spoke at the Moldovan American Convention and met with President Maya Sandu. under President Sandhu's leadership, the country has made significant strides in a short period of time to root out corruption and enact reforms, sought increased European integration, and really, in cooperation with the United States, has gone after Russian-aligned officials and entities. Maintaining and strengthening our relationship with Moldova is absolutely critical to furthering this progress and promoting resilience to Russian malign influence. And much of this work is done through USAID, and I met with the administrator there, and Ambassador McKee, and she's done a great job. But what do you feel we can do to support and bolster Moldova's economy and work with the administration there? And what are we doing to promote energy security in Moldova as well?
Well, first of all, thank you for speaking at the conference. Thank you for your support for the Ukraine supplementals, because it is actually through those supplementals that we have been able to make a strategic investment in Moldova to take not just USAID programming, but across the board energy investments and other lines of effort to a different level to meet the moment where somebody who has come into office, swept into office on an anti-corruption agenda, as you say, on a reformist agenda, on an integration with the West agenda, but finds herself being subjected to Putin's energy blackmail on a daily basis. There's great vulnerability in that for her, as you know. We have worked with her to come up with an energy plan. We've also, our mission in Moldova has worked with our mission in Ukraine, because actually the Ukrainian developments in the energy sector have actually enabled Moldova to rely on the Ukrainian grid more than they had in the past. But it's obviously going to take years for the full kind of energy independence that she's seeking, and I really hope that the United States can be with her and the Moldovan people every step of the way.
In the limited time I have left, with respect to Haiti, obviously there's been gang violence activity. The government has, basically been overrun. What is USAID doing this year to improve conditions in Haiti?
Well, like other members of the interagency, we're very focused on the security situation, because many of our programs now have been impeded by virtue of the spreading gang violence. And so the question of whether there can be some kind of multinational police or other security force to support the Haitian National Police is one that, like others in the U.S. government, we are pushing. We are also, through our democracy assistance, trying to support civil society and other efforts to finally get a political path forward, because the political insecurity and lack of a political horizon combined with the physical insecurity, again, just makes for a very chaotic situation. In addition, we're doing humanitarian programming to try to reach people who we can still reach where conditions allow.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Barra for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are dozens, hundreds of reasons why I'm proud to be an American. One of the things I'm most proud about is what we did in the 75 years post-World War II. The fact that through the Marshall Plan we rebuilt Europe, created stable democracies, avoided a continental war. What we did helping rebuild Japan, creating a stable democracy, an ally. What we did, stepping up to defend the Korean Peninsula, but then working with the Korean people to take what was once one of the poorest countries in the world to what is a Korean miracle today. And we can follow that example over and over again. Those weren't Democratic or Republican ideals. Those were American ideals of being present, investing, working with folks. And there used to be a time when we celebrated that as an institution, and I think we should be proud of that aid and development. I also, listening to some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I hear them talk about how we've got to be present in the world. When we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, when we talk about countering PRC influence, but you can't say that on the one hand and then denigrate the tools that we have available for aid development, fostering democracy, building that. That is USAID. That is our foreign aid and development programs. That is the State Department, and we want to be present around the world. We're talking about budgets here. Often I get the impression that my colleagues think we spent an exorbitant amount on foreign aid and development. Administrator Power, if we were to just cap aid and development budget at 2% of the federal budget, would you take that deal?
Yes, please.
Exactly. So just again, we spend a minuscule amount, and while we spend more than any other country in the world, Administrator Power, on a per capita, per GDP, I guess per GDP basis, are we at the top of spending on foreign aid and development?
We are not. And if I could just give you one example, because it just recently came to my attention, the American people and you all have been so generous on Ukraine. We talked, Representative Keating spoke about the investments that we make on the civilian side as well as on the military side. Norway just announced a $5 billion package that is something like 1.7% of GDP. Just to give a sense of the scale of investment there. So I know there's a sense of we're doing a lot of this alone. We're not. We really are leveraging what we're doing to get other countries to step up.
Great. So let me actually follow that line of reasoning. And again, I'm very proud of what we did in aid development and creating peace and stability in the post-World War II world in those 75 years. Going forward, obviously, we have partners, Japan, Korea, talked about Norway, our European allies. Resources are tight, and I understand we've got an obligation to protect the taxpayers' dollars. What are some examples of how we're working with like-valued, like-minded partners to, again, go into third countries and do that aid and development work?
Well, there are things like multilateral funds, like the Global Fund on HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria. And what I love about that is that if the U.S., basically the U.S., if we can deliver our resources, it is a formula by which we can only give as much as we are able to mobilize from other countries. When it comes to global health, we are part of something called a Global Health Financing Facility, where I think we've invested something like $400 million and turned that into $1.6 billion. You see this on issue after issue after issue. As we, for example, in line with the prior exchange, changed our approach to democracy promotion and invest in these new tools to kind of support democratic reformers, we go to country after country after country and say, hey, we've just created this new insurance fund to protect journalists around the world who are doing anti-corruption work. Will you join us? So there's not a sector that we think about only from the standpoint of what we do. We want to do just like what we do in the Global Fund, which is for every dollar that the U.S. spends, we get $2 from other donors. And it works. When countries know that they can unlock U.S. taxpayer resources, that makes them also able to go to their parliaments and their people and say, look, we're all jumping together here.
Great. So that does seem like a model for aid and development moving forward, where we're leveraging our resources, leveraging the power of our taxpayer dollars to also then get other partners and donors engaged.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Keene for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator Power, for being with us today. Our nation is once again in the midst of a great power competition across the globe, at a time when it's critical to exercise every tool in our national security toolkit. Foreign assistance plays an important role. Administrator Power, your agency accounts for more than half of all U.S. foreign assistance. And right now, the world is facing crises, whether it is the war in Ukraine, conflicts in countries in Africa, CP's nefarious exploitation of assistance as a policy tool, many, many others. I am concerned by reports of the White House is not planning to ask Congress for new Ukraine funding before the end of the fiscal year. I know this is outside of your direct wheelhouse, but presidential drawdown authority is running dangerously low, and I find it unacceptable that we are providing smaller biweekly PDA packages as Ukraine approaches its critical counteroffensive strategy than we were earlier in the war. Moreover, the FY24 request for Ukraine is comparable to pre-war levels and does not reflect the reality of the full-scale war of conquest that Russia is waging against it. From your perspective, can you please discuss Ukraine's economic and humanitarian needs in the coming months?
Sorry, I thought you were continuing. Thank you so much, and thank you for championing this vital cause, and also for recognizing the interlinkages between the battlefront and the need for security assistance rapidly and appropriately, and the other front, which is the ongoing battle for Ukraine to keep its finances flowing, to keep the lights on, but also to continue to strengthen its democracy and its institutions, because that's the ultimate, in addition to wartime defeat, the ultimate repudiation of the Putin project. You know, I think for us, we have been, one of the most important things that you have given us is resources to provide direct budget support. And that is money that, without which the Ukrainian government could not have survived the last year and 3 months. It is money that pays for health workers, for teachers, for health services, for the most vulnerable in the society who otherwise wouldn't have access to pensions. I mean, when you're looking at a $5 billion monthly deficit, $1.5 billion a month from the United States, leveraged to the prior exchange with Congressman Bera to secure $1.5 billion, if not $1.6 billion now this year from the European Union, is absolutely vital. I think that as we look out on the civilian side, these resources are doing everything from helping Ukraine do what it just did, which people haven't really taken note of sufficiently, I think, which is survive the winter, as Putin sought to weaponize winter. Our ability, thanks to you all, to provide $400 million in pipes and boilers and thermal blankets and generators, you know, that was the difference between Putin achieving his war aim. But again, this isn't just on the battlefield, achieving his war aim by actually sapping the will of the Ukrainian people. It is those resources that you have provided that were so indispensable. With regard to the timing,
do you think that we need additional resources before and at the end of the fiscal or calendar year?
You know, I'm working with, we're working with the White House to think through the timing. We were very grateful to get in December an infusion that, at least on the direct budget support, will take us to the end of the fiscal year. But the more notice we have about how resources, I mean, we will act very differently if we don't know we have more resources after September as we start to get deeper into the summer. So I certainly think that the conversations back and forth are very important in helping us plan how we stretch out the resources that have been allocated to us to provide to the Ukrainians.
Okay. And then on the issue of what's going on in South Africa right now, it's deeply concerning to me. Inviting Xi and Putin to the country is not a reflection of the South African people. What does this budget reflect in terms of support for institutions and people wanting a democratic future for South Africa?
In this budget proposal, we don't have large programs in South Africa because it's such an advanced economy. We have very big health programs. But in this budget, we have requested an additional $3 million in democracy, rights, and governance support to do everything from support for civil society, anti-corruption work, voter education, because they're heading into elections in 2024. But let me obviously just get on record as well, just grave concern with the events of recent days and with some of the actions to which you have referenced. We still find ways, of course, to work with South Africa on a whole host of regional and international challenges. And we've had a very robust dialogue these last weeks on some of the issues that you have raised. So hopefully, again, the bilateral relationship will continue to offer as much as it has, I think, for both the American people and the South African people over many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Castro for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Administrator Power, it's good to see you today. Thank you for your testimony. You and I have discussed the importance of supporting innovation in development programs previously. And I think that those of us who support development assistance should not shy away from being candid about where our programs work and where they don't work. As you know, Rep. Young Kim and I recently introduced the Fostering Innovation and Global Development Act. This legislation would strengthen USAID's ability to generate innovative approaches to international development and would establish a proven solutions program at USAID to identify and scale up those highly effective interventions. I believe that this legislation is well aligned with your goals to support better use of evidence in USAID programs, and I'm wondering if you've had a chance to look over the legislation, and if so, would love to get your views on it, and also see how we can work together to make foreign assistance much more effective.
Well, Congressman Castro, let me just thank you for always getting in the weeds of sort of how we're trying to do our business. Some of our staffing concerns, this objective that I think we all share, which is how to ensure that we have the most nimble, the most responsive, the most innovative agency. I think we think that the draft legislation would provide really interesting opportunities. We're heartened by the fact that it has bipartisan support from Representative Kim, who's also such a champion of these issues. We're grateful already for the innovation fellows that have been placed at USAID. Certainly, if you remove the $100,000 award cap, that would allow the agency to significantly increase its impact in priority areas, including climate and food security. And I think we already have, and I know, again, you're very familiar with it, but the Development Innovation Ventures Scale Up Stage 4 initiative, trying to use a grant from Open Philanthropy to support our new Chief Economist's office as well, to be able to just, in a sense, just like they do in the private sector, pick those winners where small investments on the front end can help startups or entrepreneurs or civic-minded individuals scale what they're doing with great development impact down the line. And you're familiar with the programs in the past that have made such a difference.
Sure.
So we're excited to build on the DIV 17-to-1 return on investment. That's a pretty handsome ratio, and we're hopeful that this legislation or something like it would help us advance that goal.
No, well, thank you. And thank you so much for your focus on innovation, on evidence-based solutions, on scaling up the best solutions, on all of it. And you just mentioned that you recently created the position of Chief Economist and appointed Dean Carlin to the role. I think this is a great opportunity to better integrate the use of evidence into USAID programs. And so how do you measure success for this new position at USAID? How are you setting it up to succeed and integrating evidence across USAID?
Well, we are starting by addressing some of the attrition that had occurred, to my surprise, over the years at USAID in terms of economic expertise. The number of economists on staff is much fewer now, and not because anybody intended it as such, but just other priorities took center stage. So creating an Office of the Chief Economist, hiring a highly regarded economist like Dean, and then building out expertise in everything from debt restructuring, which so many of our partners are crying out for support on, to building in as a design feature impact evaluations, cost effectiveness analysis. I mean, in a world of scarce resources, even if we got every penny we asked for in our 24 budget requests, it's still too little compared to everything that we've talked about vis-a-vis the PRC or humanitarian needs. And so that cost-effective analysis, to me, is a huge part of my responsibility in my tenure, to leave the agency in a position to, again, to know that every penny that we spend is being leveraged and being optimized in terms of cost effectiveness. So he's building out the team. Again, it's a wide array of expertise that we need. We're getting university professors to come on loan for a couple years when we can, but as we hire foreign service, civil service, and others, bringing in that economic expertise and those people who can do those evaluations, supplementing the measurement, evaluation, and learning units that we already have and that have been working very productively over the years. It's very important.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's a wise move, and please let us know how we can help enable, through any authorities, the success of the Chief Economist as we go forward. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Baird for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Administrator, we appreciate you being here. And since we're talking about budgets, according to the USAID, between October 21 and August of 22, the United States was the largest donor to Sudan, with more than $457 million in humanitarian assistance, and that's almost $100 million more than in 2020. However, Sudan policy still remains a disaster. Even on April the 15th of this year, 2023, more conflict broke out between the rival factions of the military government in West Sudan. So my question is this. Is USAID rethinking their approach in Sudan? And if so, how is the USAID working with Sudan to fix this policy? And then lastly, what measures are being taken to ensure anti-corruption is not happening with the American taxpayer dollars in Sudan?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, let me distinguish a couple different phases in the U.S. relationship with Sudan just in that period that you were describing. So, as you might recall, thanks to a popular uprising among people who were fed up with the corruption and the repression, you actually had an AU brokered deal with a civilian prime minister, and yes, these same military elements who've caused such havoc recently, but they constituted a kind of a transitional authority, and they were allegedly aiming to get to civilian government. Then there was a coup in 2021. Prior to the coup, I think the previous administration and the Biden administration were very enthusiastic about meeting this reform moment. They locked up somebody who'd been indicted for genocide, Omar al-Bashir, who'd ruled for decades and perpetrated a genocide against the people of Darfur. So at that point, we were thinking about doing a fair amount of development programming, working in social services, trying to strengthen institutions, and did some of that in that period. But the coup ended all of that. And so our work really then migrated to just what you pointed to, which is humanitarian assistance, because it's a poor country. It's a country that put itself in isolation with its actions over the years. And we were trying to help keep people alive through the World Food Program, David Beasley, which David Beasley was championing and helping us figure out how best to channel that food and other assistance. But with very difficult climate conditions and very poor investments, as you say, in the infrastructure of the country over the years, that humanitarian assistance was life or death, and it was needs-based. We're now in a situation, as you know, where a civil war has broken out between the two actors who had conspired to overthrow the civilian prime minister, and now we are just trying to basically meet the needs of people who are in full flight. I mean, you will have 1 million, you probably already have between internally displaced and displaced to neighboring countries, 1 million people already displaced. And already, again, the needs of the country, a third of the country needed humanitarian assistance before this military conflict broke out. So your question is a very fair one. Humanitarian assistance is incredibly important. I mean, you see, nobody wants humanitarian assistance on this earth. They want to be able to fend for themselves, feed their families on their own. But if they are having to get humanitarian assistance, it's because they don't have other options. And if we can get our partners moving again on the ground despite the insecurity, that's what we do. It's what the America does around the world, and it's why we're known as the world's leading humanitarian donor and very compassionate, and it's a form of soft power and all the like. That doesn't substitute for the core challenge that you put your finger on, which is, when is Sudan going to be back at peace? When are civilians going to be in charge? When are the people going to have a say as to who governs them? With regard to your anti-corruption concern, that is really about working only with trusted partners, and that's why large international organizations that have in place the safeguards and the systems, and who we've worked with in other parts of the world, where we can have confidence and represent to you that we think the money is going to the intended beneficiaries. That's what we're doing right now in Sudan. But I want to stress, only 22 of our 33 partners are working right now, and that's with very limited capacity. So sadly, we are not able to reach all the people that we would like to at the moment.
Thank you very, very much, and I appreciate that perspective. I see my time's almost up, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Phillips for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mast, and welcome, Madam Administrator. I spent this morning at the Vietnam War Memorial. My dad's name is on that stone, 58,000 others. I thought about my friend, Mr. Baird, who served the U.S. with honor and made extraordinary sacrifices. And as I was walking and observing other veterans at the wall, I thought to myself, what if our country dedicated the same energy and resources and intention to diplomacy that we do to national defense? Some have referenced how much money $32 billion is, and darn right it is. And we have every right and need and responsibility to ensure oversight and accountability for it. But your budget is about 3.5% of that $900 or so billion, and I recognize that the best defense is often the most successful development and investments, and that is why I so respect what you and your teammates do, and I recognize that it is indeed an art, not a science. So thank you, most of all. I'm the ranking member of the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia Subcommittee, working with my friend and colleague, Mr. Wilson. Our region has great challenges, from Tunisia to Lebanon to Syria to Yemen, among so many others. But despite the challenges, there's some good signs. The Abraham Accords, I think, are to be celebrated. The Negev Forum is another example. But I wanted to ask a question about the Nita Lowey Middle East Partnership for Peace Act. I was recently in Israel, spent some time in East Jerusalem with some Palestinian entrepreneurs. I asked them the question about these dollars and these programs. But I want to hear from you. How do you see those programs working? How do you measure success? And anything you can share about some of these micro programs and their outcomes.
Thank you. What I would say is that we have really picked up steam on the Middle East on MEPA. You see that in terms of the visibility of the program, of people coming forward with initiatives. It's challenging because the conceit of the program is cross-line collaborations, and that gets harder as the security situation deteriorates, as it has. And there's a ton of polarization as well, and some skepticism about whether peace is possible or a two-state solution can be secured. But I think what we try to do is, as you say, with these micro grants or starting small, work on everything from a startup that might be doing something that, again, brings in people from both communities, a water quality project that's going to have benefits for people on both sides of the lines, female empowerment, which is something that would serve, communities everywhere. The board for MEPA, which was named by the ranking and chair of each of our oversight committees, just visited, and I think came back, really blown away by the good that's being done. But again, it's critically important that the other that the political process gets reawakened at some point. It's critically important that people have the security that they need in their day-to-day lives, to be able to even go out and experience what a startup has to offer, or do some kind of joint sporting event or something across communities. But I think the MEPA board, which is a very diverse composition, reflecting the diversity of our chair and rankings across the House and Senate, they came back really feeling as if this was exactly the right way to go, especially in this period where not a lot is happening in the political negotiation track.
Thank you. I've got about a minute left. I also want to talk about load sharing. We're the largest food assistance donor in the world, but I'm concerned that other countries are not providing what I think they can and should. Is that a fair perspective?
I think there's no question that the war in Ukraine has pulled resources away from the Middle East and North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa and places where there are great humanitarian needs. I will say that what the Europeans have done, for example, for Ukrainian refugees coming in, it's 17 billion euros worth of support, and that is counting against their overseas development assistance overall budgets, just in the way that they are scorekeeping there and their budget conversations.
So I've only got 10 seconds left.
Sorry,
If I could
yes.
just ask, many of us, all of us, I think, on this committee spend time with ambassadors from countries all around
Yes,
the world.
please lobby, if
Well,
that's,
what I was gonna ask.
please,
Would you like
please
to
lobby. Yeah, I
is-
think
is-
untraditional partners who haven't been big givers, but have the resources we know to step up in wholly new ways to meet the moment is really important. And we look forward to when the war in Ukraine is over and we can get back to right-sizing investments all around the world. We've been very lucky because of the supplementals to be able to both support the people of Ukraine and meet this food insecurity moment and deal with the destabilizing effects of the Ukraine war in other parts of the world. That has been harder, for other countries. If the pie doesn't get bigger, fundamentally it's going to come out of somewhere. So thank you.
Thank you. My time's expired, and I yield back. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Waltz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Power, I've noticed in your budget requests that aid is essentially requested about the same amount overall for Afghanistan aid across the programs in 24 as in 22, roughly. It's almost as though nothing happened there in terms of your budgetary request. Regardless of the number, can we just talk for a moment on your visibility on to how that aid is being distributed? I understand it's going through the UN then goes through local implementers. I'm hearing consistently from Afghans and from people in the region, for example, the Taliban are essentially, and Haqqanis are registering NGOs amongst their members and receiving that aid. Can you provide the committee a list of NGOs that the UN is providing the aid to?
Yes, I think that absolutely is something that those would be the sub-awardees, and that is something we should be able to do. And, you know, obviously because we don't have, let me first just say about the number, that doesn't accord with what I think is true. And so I wonder if there's just a timing issue where the 22 number is in fact the number enacted after the withdrawal. Our development, you know, we had huge development programs there that were such important investments in girls' education and civil society and independent media on the ground. So all of that halted.
But the bottom line is,
yes.
Set the number aside. Can you confirm that the UN is or isn't distributing aid to Taliban and Haqqani-linked groups?
Well, they certainly. I can tell you that we have had no reporting to that effect. I mean, there are.
You've had no reporting that the Taliban is influencing or
that the UN is giving aid to the Taliban, which I thought was the question.
Which are Taliban-linked groups, right? These are groups that are essentially registering as NGOs.
Let me not say we have not, but I am not aware of reporting to that effect. If our partner, let's say in this case WFP or UNICEF, you know, or if you're hearing these reports, if you bring those reports to us and to our Inspector General, I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that we would.
Can you confirm, because what we are hearing regularly and repeatedly is the Taliban have put officials on every one of these NGO governing bodies, that they are threatening these groups to provide it in accordance with Taliban and Haqqani wishes, that they are discriminating ethnically, that they are rewarding those who occupy formerly minority-occupied villages and homes, particularly in central Afghanistan. Can you just confirm to us that that's happening or not happening?
I mean, the Taliban runs Afghanistan, and they control activities, and they control activities in areas where our implementing partners are working. In instances, for example, if the Taliban were to instruct an implementing partner official to not give money to a disfavored ethnic group or to women, or
are you confident you have visibility
our
that that's
partners
happening?
have an obligation to report it. I am confident that we have systems where if these allegations, if you are getting insight into this happening in specific places, we would have to cut off assistance.
But it's a self-reporting system.
No, we have third-party reporting. We have organizations on the ground that are doing monitoring of the implementing partners. Say again?
In Afghanistan, in a place controlled by the. Regardless of that, I mean, we know the Haqqani, in particular, are also running Afghanistan. Their interior minister is Siraj Haqqani, running the police. You're well aware that it's a foreign terrorist organization. It's illegal to provide directly or indirectly material support to a terrorist organization. So I would look forward to the committee coming back to me with real systems, not kind of a hope and a prayer on third-party monitoring in essentially a denied space. Are you confident that that's not going to terrorism, that it's not supporting a terrorist organization, or that they're not essentially directing those funds?
What I am confident of is that the United Nations partners that we have robust systems. Let me finish, and it's I think what you are looking for is more visibility into the granularity of what those systems look like, if that's what we are relying upon. I also
You're confident in the UN systems.
I believe everyone is aware that if U.S. assistance
Director
is going,
of Power, that should be a yes or
is going,
I'm confident or I'm not confident. This is a lot of taxpayer money.
Absolutely.
Going into a war zone, and I'm out of time.
Yes.
the fact that you can't say, Congressman, I'm confident this money is going where it should be.
I am confident that, but what I want, the reason we had this exchange earlier, I'm not
We're
sure if
going-
you were here.
we're going
if I
to
could
cut
just
those
finish
funds.
because you're accusing me. You know, there are issues related to working in a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, as you might imagine, for our implementing partners. For example, when they pay their utility bills, that money is going, that's an incidental fee that is going into ultimately
But
you
that's
know,
very
to the Afghan
different
government.
than the Haqqani, a foreign terrorist organization.
No, exactly. So that's why I'm
winners
asking
and
you
losers
if
and
they're
using taxpayer dollars to decide who
What-
gets
what I-
this money
what I
and
am
who
co-
lives or
I am-
dies, and basically empowering themselves
Correct.
with our money. And the fact that you're not slapping the table saying it's not happening, Mr. Congressman, I can tell you that, I think would be outrageous to every American. And I can
But I
tell
agree
you
it would
this
be
House,
outrageous,
this
and that's
committee
why we have
will
systems
seek
in
to
place,
cut
and we
those
have an
funds
inspector
until you can
general,
do
and we
that.
have reporting requirements of our partners, and we'll cut off partners who are providing assistance in the manner that you're describing.
Gentlemen.
That's what I can attest.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Jacobs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Administrator Power, I want to thank you for your comments about the Nigerian attack, and you know, make sure you know that we're here, stand ready to do anything we can to help make sure that we get those who have not yet been identified found and back home safe, and condolences to the families of those we've lost. And I also want to thank you for your words about Sudan and express my solidarity with the Sudanese people. I was glad to see a DART set up. Now we need to make sure that enough resources are allocated to actually be able to respond to the humanitarian crisis, and also make sure that we're working with Sudanese organizations that are currently there on the ground doing the life-saving work that needs support. And we know that a lot of that work we can't do now because of this situation. So as the ranking member of the Africa Subcommittee, I'm very focused on ensuring Congress and the Biden administration prioritizes the African continent. I think we heard from a lot of people today how important that is for strategic competition. I was just on the continent last month visiting Benin, Niger, Senegal, Ghana, and Kenya. What I heard echoed what the chairman said he heard from folks in every conversation, whether it was with our partner countries or with our own military. They said that, yes, they need military assistance, but even more, they need increased economic development assistance. And in fact, our own military said on multiple occasions that no amount of money we can give them will substitute for USAID's increased presence in these countries. And yet, every single House Republican, including every single Republican on this committee, including the chairman, voted for a budget that would cut the foreign assistance by at least 22%, but actually, if they do what they say and hold defense and vets harmless, actually could be up to 50%. So I was hoping you could explain the consequences of these proposed foreign assistance cuts, particularly in Africa, where China and Russia have been making major inroads.
Thank you. Well, we've been having some back and forth on that already in this hearing. I mean, it's everything from the heartbreaking 13 million kids who won't be immunized for preventable diseases to strategically blunderous. You know, I would note in Latin America, and this is reflected in other parts of the world as well, but you see consistent polling now that shows a drop in support for PRC engagements by host governments or by the countries in which we work, and an uptick in a desire to work with the United States along the lines of what you've described in Africa. And as others have said, again, to vacate that space or even just to diminish, because again, if we are cutting our programs, let's say in half or by a quarter, that's a program that they would have had last year that they won't have, right? So what you'll see is the USAID shingle going away, or the number of beneficiaries we can reach, you know, cut in half. And you know what we're also seeing is the PRC stepping up. I used earlier the ratio that the PRC has been doing around $9 in loan for every $1 in grant, and we the opposite, $9 in grants, so because we're not interested in creating dependencies and saddling countries with debt. That's actually changing. I think the PRC is seeing the utility of coming in. They're seeing the buyer's remorse that countries saddled with debt are themselves experiencing. So at just the time the PRC is thinking, oh, well, maybe we'll do it a little more like USAID, and we'll come in and we won't ask for things right at the beginning. We'll make these longer term investments for us to be pulling down programming at just the time that we want to support an open and secure digital ecosystem, to walk away and say, no, we don't want you to do Huawei. We know the national security reasons for that, but actually we don't have any support to offer you as you think through how to create, a free and open internet, or how to bring out other providers. I mean, that would be incredibly counterproductive. And if I could the last thing I'd say is, your point about economic development, economic growth, we've made our budget request, but one of the things that we are massively underinvested in is just core economic development, economic growth, programming resources. We're great on health and can always use more, but our Feed the Future program is a flagship program. We don't have anything comparable that other countries really associate with the United States, and the combination of us and DFC, which I do think is every year doing more and more deals, really investing more and more in meeting people where they are at this moment of economic vulnerability, I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I actually have a letter from 18 retired military leaders on the importance of development investments that I'd like to enter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And, my colleagues like to talk a lot about the southern border. I would just also say that we know that if they cut what they want to, that would also cut our programs in Central America, which is exactly the thing they say they want us to do. Just really quickly, I know we talked about making sure the efficiency of aid and the effectiveness. I know you have a localization agenda. I'm a big supporter. I've got legislation to help support you. Would love for you to just talk briefly about why that matters for cost effectiveness and how that can help potentially assuage some of the concerns from my friends on the other side of the aisle.
Gentlelady's time has expired. If you have time to answer in the next round, sure, by all means. But the chair now recognizes Mr. Smith for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Administrator Power, it's great to see you and your senior staff again. Thank you. We've worked together on a lot of issues in the past, so it's great to see you. And thank you for your leadership. This past Friday, I chaired a hearing on combating human trafficking. We had 3 amazing survivors, victims who have become bold leaders in the effort to end and eradicate modern-day slavery. We had a couple of NGOs. We also had the ambassador at large, Cindy Dyer, and with a great deal of respect, but also with a great deal of expectation, I did ask her a question about how many of those who are coming across our border have been trafficked. We know that too often in the minds of the media, there's a conflation of the issue of smuggling versus trafficking, although very often smugglers do end up trafficking their victims because they realize how vulnerable they are, particularly young women and young children. So it's like an engraved invitation to the exploiters and the predators to hurt and to destroy and to rape. And so my question to you, I know Homeland Security takes the lead, but we've tried to get that information, can't get it. How many? There's 85,000 unaccompanied minors that are, and that's just one estimate. Have they been sold into a trafficking situation? Do we have any sense of the magnitude of this issue so we can combat it? If you don't have the numbers, how do you, the who, what, when, where, why of it all, how do you combat it? So if you could lend any, because I know you do work on this, and
well, we absolutely do work on this, thanks to your support, and good to see you. And again, thank you for all the things that we get to do with you and all the insights you bring to us when you travel the world on these kinds of issues. I don't have the breakdown on the border data. I'm not sure myself. I can look into this, but what the surveys, we do a lot of intention to migrate surveys as a government. We certainly look at what the reasons for migration are when somebody is engaged or apprehended at the border. We work in the home countries and in countries where, for example, we work in Colombia where Venezuelan migrants have come, in the communities in which those Venezuelan migrants have settled, in the hopes that we can reach them so that they know their rights, but also reach them with economic programming and economic investments so that they don't see fit to rely on smugglers. That's a different question than the kind of law enforcement effort that you need also to crack down on both the smugglers and the traffickers, again, which lives with different agencies.
Again, with respect, get that number, even if it's a guesstimate?
I don't want to, it's so far beyond my jurisdiction, but what I know I can get you is a breakdown of all of our programming in the hemisphere that's aimed at combating trafficking and gender-based violence, for that as well. But But on that, I mean, it really is, as you
Well,
said, a
you know, in the
DHS question.
2023 TIP report, because obviously the U.S. is included in the narratives of the countries, it does make a very strong point, a recommendation that we screen for trafficking, and to the best of my knowledge, we're not doing it. And that was made a year ago with the 2022 TIP report. So
Let me engage my colleagues at
Please do.
DHS and see, you know, what the barriers are or whether that data exists somewhere and we're just not accessing it.
I appreciate that. Let me ask you with regards to Nagorno-Karabakh. You know, 120,000 people, Armenians, are subject to the Azerbaijani government's blockade. Maybe you could shed some light on whether or not that any aid, because ICRC can't get through, if you could speak to that. Secondly, on the Chaldean Catholics, you know, those who survived the genocide by ISIS, you know, we've talked about this many times. You know, how well are we doing with helping those individuals, not just the Catholics, but all the others, the Yazidis? And then on the TB issue, I noticed in your submission, last year we spent $394 million on tuberculosis. This year the request is for $358, a $36 million cut. Is that because we're making progress on TB, or is it, you know, there just wasn't enough money to go around in the budget? Whatever insight you could provide on that.
Thank you. What was the first question? I'm going to work backwards, but what was the first one?
The first one was on...
Oh, on Nagorno-Karabakh. Okay. So with regard to TB, no, there were major setbacks because of COVID and the inability to maintain the progress that we had before the pandemic struck. So sadly, it's not because things have been trending in the right direction, but it is, you know, as we do things like invest in global health security, expanding the number of countries that have adequate surveillance to spot pandemics, which is in turn an investment in our own national security. As we do more in the primary healthcare system, for example, seeking to train, we have a $20 million request, I believe, for training of healthcare workers who are massively underpaid, and yet that's the foundation for TB, malaria, all the disease-based programming that we do. So I believe it was just not enough to go around. Second, in terms of our dialogue, ongoing dialogue, you know, I think on religious minorities generally in the MENA region, there's not a huge budgetary allocation. I think it's around $15 million over the last couple of years. The emphasis has been on the reintegration of Yazidis, the reintegration in this is not in Iraq, but in Lebanon, of Christians who were displaced by the port of Beirut blast, alerting Christians in Iraq to the rights that they have, you know, helping them organize a little bit within the Iraqi, you know, political dynamic or ecosystem, and then helping them as well recover from shocks, you know, whatever that shock is, whether pandemic, climate, et cetera. OTI, as we discussed when you were last in my office, also is doing work in a more stopgap way, but with particular attention to that population. On Nagorno-Karabakh, I think you weren't in the room when I shared that actually, I gather that an ICRC convoy did in fact get in today, but access has been very, very limited. You know, many staples are in short supply. We understand we're not physically present on the ground. And you asked how food is getting in when it gets in. It should be coming in through commercial means, as it always was. But since the road has been blocked and the checkpoints have been erected, commercial access has not been possible. So we understand it to have been a combination of Russian peacekeepers and ICRC deliveries when those can go in. We have had, USAID has sent 2 assessment missions.
Gentleman's time has expired.
To the
Chair
assessment
now recognizes
2 assessment missions to the region, and we are encouraging the UN to send an interagency assessment mission as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Administrator, for coming and talking with us. I really appreciate it. I had a couple other questions, but I wanted to just kind of start because I have to say I was a bit alarmed by some of the conversation earlier in this hearing that was, you know, questioning the importance of what USAID does, of what development does, and this type of humanitarian assistance does in our broader efforts. I guess I just wanted to start by kind of asking you to just kind of help us, just kind of in your own words, explain the role that USAID plays, in particular in our Indo-Pacific strategy that I know the Biden administration has worked hard to be able to craft together. Can you kind of explain to us, you know, the role that USAID plays there?
Well, I hear broad support for development and for USAID at this hearing, so maybe I'm hearing what I want to hear and disregarding the rest. I think fair questions about accountability and whether resources are going where they belong, and hard questions about how to prioritize. With regard to the Indo-Pacific, there are so many sectors in which USAID is working that it will be hard in our respective time to go through them, but. Needless to say, there's been democratic backsliding in large parts of the region, so continuing to support civil society, independent media, those who are holding governments accountable. There is a very strong desire for energy transition in a lot of those countries because clean energy and renewables are now cheaper to employ. So I was just in Vietnam working with countries that want to make that transition to make sure that the regulatory environment is the right one, to make sure that when they are using solar panels, they are procuring them not from Xinjiang, but from places that respect the rights of the people who are working in the factories, fueling economic growth and development. I mean, with a burgeoning population, ensuring that the millions of people who come online every year have access to work. That's an investment in stability. It's also an investment in future markets for U.S. companies.
One thing that you also mentioned earlier in a different way is that I just feel like so much about this is at that critical node of this strategy about coalition building and how we engage in that capacity. And for instance, the more that we can make this not just this kind of just U.S. versus China, but the more that we talk about a global coalition coming together. And here in this space, I feel like there's been some really interesting movements. I know last year Japan, the U.S., and Australia announced trilateral cooperation on 5G network development in an effort to kind of hedge against some of what China's been doing on that front. I want to ask about your level of coordination or cooperation with other regional partners to be able to maximize and make sure that we're engaged in that kind of level of coalition building.
Thank you. I think there have been major inroads through the Quad. I think you've seen major initiatives come out of that, feeding into the G20. I'll give you one example in the Pacific, where we're just amping up USAID's physical presence on the ground. But with Australia, we have managed an undersea cable effort in Micronesia and in Papua New Guinea that is going to mean a connection to the outside world that would not have existed before, and something that probably wouldn't have been possible for any one of our countries to do alone, but actually doing it in lockstep has been very important. We've just signed an MOU with Taiwan, hoping really to encourage their substantial investments. They're already making them bilaterally, but again, if we can do this work together, we'll all be better off. And then lastly, just one part of the challenge with some of the smaller countries in the Pacific, for example, is they can't access, they have trouble accessing large development financing because it's so resource intensive to fill out the forms and create bankable projects. So with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, to work with each of those countries to provide human capacity and technical support so that they can submit proposals to unlock much larger sums than USAID or any development agency can.
And as we're working together with these different partners here, how do we do better at making sure we're getting credit for what we're doing? I think oftentimes it's this question of like, do people see what we're doing? And we don't always necessarily do that kind of at the front end, but I'm kind of curious, where can we do to be better at letting people know what we're doing?
Well, Chairman McCall actually normally asks me this question because he's, I think, one of the sponsors of some of the branding language that has come out of Congress, branding requirements, and USAID is pretty recognizable. I think we're pretty good at branding the things we do. But if you're providing a microfinance loan to a small female farmer, that's difficult to brand in the same way that some of the bricks and mortar investments we've made over the years have done. I think the information space is where we need to tell our story better, and I've just released a new policy framework whereby new investments in communications and a new way of thinking about communications are now central to our reform agenda, because with all the misinformation coming at us, with the PRC doing what it does, this imperative on telling our story and showing the impact that our work has had, not just here in the United States, but actually in the countries in which we work, I do think that modernizing that effort is very important.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator, for coming here today. I was looking at the website for USAID, and it said the goal is to save lives, reduce poverty, strengthen democratic governance, and help people progress beyond assistance. Sounds laudable. I think it's something we all probably agree with, and I think it's in the context of Russia is often a country that has a cross purpose than we do. Certainly China does. And I'm going to focus on Guatemala today, and certainly China and Russia are there. And so if we want to do those things, I think, look, the American tax dollar is important. It can do a lot of things. But one of my colleagues said he was alarmed by some of the folks here questioning what we're spending our money on, and that the fact that we might not spend that money. When I find out we spent nearly $1 million to train and support the LGBTQ+ Victory Institute that trains and supports left-wing candidates in Guatemala after Guatemala pushed to be the pro-life capital of America, and then invested $11 million in assistance for groups to push for abortion activism in Guatemala. I'm just wondering, Administrator, how that fits into save lives, reduce poverty, strengthen democratic governance, and help people progress beyond assistance. Can you help me out there?
Sure.
How's that help?
Well, I want to say off the bat, I'm not familiar with either of those programs. We have, as you can imagine,
I'm sure you got a lot.
Thousands of programs around the
heavy
world.
is
But
the head that wears the crown, man.
But I am absolutely happy. I would actually like to hear more about what you're
I'm
referring to.
going to give you some
and-
more.
Okay, no, that too. Okay, but for starters, to simply say that we do stand with marginalized communities, and we do have a situation where you see significant spikes in attacks.
We're not talking
on
about
LGBTQI.
slavery, ma'am. We're not talking about what's happening in East Turkestan. We're talking about different viewpoints. This is a sovereign country which we wish to help, and instead of helping them economically, we're telling them culturally. We're spending our money to change them culturally because we disagree with where they are culturally.
That is not the approach that we take either
But it
in
is.
Guatemala. No, it
Let
isn't.
me give you another one. We spent $30 million for climate and environmental-related programs, including funds to teach radical climate agenda in schools. Ma'am, if we gave USAID money under a different administration, and they took the NRA to that country and said, we're going to train all these kids in self-defense and gun ownership, what would you have to say about that?
Congressman, just the language that you're using suggests that these are not USAID. These are somebody's characterization of USAID programs.
Okay,
The
well,
idea
let me
that
give
we'd
you
be
another
saying
one.
Radical left climate agenda.
Let me give you this one. In
that
2021, so
we'd
that's
be
not too
funding.
long ago, USAID headlined an event to discuss plurinational constituent assembly, in line with the indigenous agenda of radical leftist groups, including those sponsored by Chile and Bolivia. Ma'am, like my colleague just said, are we promoting the good things that the United States of America does through USAID? I suspect we're promoting this in Guatemala, and it's not looking too good for the United States of America.
So I really want to make sure that at some point we can correct the record, because you're characterizing these programs as if those are factual descriptions of USAID programs. I can't tell you exactly the right way to describe the programs that you're describing, but I can assure you that the descriptions you have do not belong on a record of fact here in the Congress. What I can also say is that, as you probably know, a very significant share of the Guatemalan population is indigenous communities.
Yeah.
It is the case.
But they
that
also have
central-
property rights issues, and those kind of things destroy property ownership, which was the hallmark of climbing out of poverty. Let me give you one more, because we're running out of time, and I want you to be able to respond to it. Under education, under USAID, they financed Association Lambada, which has trained hundreds of political leaders on gender identity and sexual orientation. Well, look, I'm all for election integrity and making sure people vote and all that stuff. I'm not sure that we should be spending American tax dollars in America on political candidates and ideology any more than we should be spending them abroad. Would you agree?
I believe that the United States, a major source of our strength over the last 75 years, has been our support for human rights, and marginalized populations in countries like the ones you mentioned are often suffering more than mere discrimination or disenfranchisement. They're suffering outright attack. Without knowledge of the particulars, I'm unable to explain to you why I think it's in our
Ma'am,
interest to run that
I will
program.
get the article for
But
the
I'm
record
happy
for
to
you.
engage offline and talk more about what actually these programs
Yes,
do, because
ma'am.
I don't think that's an
And
accurate
Mr. Chairman,
account.
I'd like to submit the article for the record.
Without objection.
I yield.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Manning for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Administrator Powell, for your hard work, your dedication, and your patience today. I want to start by thanking you and USAID staff for everything you've done to help the country of Moldova. North Carolina is very proud to be partners and sister states with Moldova, and I appreciate the support the American people provide to help this democratic partner and ally. Earlier in this hearing, Ranking Member Meek said that USAID is a diplomatic tool that is a strategic investment in our future. It is also an investment in a safer, more stable global future. And I'd like to focus on a few areas where our strategic investment can bring about a safer, more stable future for critical regions. I'd like to start with the Middle East. 94 members of the House signed a bipartisan letter supporting continued funding for the Nidaloe Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, the MEPA Act, which supports people-to-people exchanges and economic partnerships to improve relationships between Israelis and Palestinians. And my colleague, Mr. Phillips, asked you a few minutes ago about the impact that some of those grants have had, and you had a positive view of what they are doing and what they can do in the future. So I'd like to ask you, what would happen to the MEPA program if the Republican budget cuts are implemented?
Well, I mean, you would be looking at, depending on the extent of the cut, if it's 22%, you know, presuming all cuts are shared equally, and I'm sure every program would have to feel the pain, you know, that kind of cut. That would mean less leverage as well to go to international partners, because again, we want to use MEPA as a means of getting others to support this kind of micro-programming. You know, depending again on the particulars, it could mean that, you know, what was meant to be a 3-year endeavor to really invest in community-to-community ties gets truncated and terminated before its time. But also, I think, you know, we have made a commitment on the basis of the bipartisanship that MEPA has enjoyed from the outset, that we're in it for the long haul, that we recognize that right now conditions are not auspicious for peace or even for much contact across lines, and yet we're going to invest in young people, in entrepreneurs, you know, in these communities that are the future. And so it would signal either at a 22% rate or a 50% rate potentially that we are much less enthusiastic about that goal.
About setting the stage for future peace in that region.
And the micro good that we can do every day. You know, if you can't change the whole world or bring peace to the region, you can change many individual worlds, and that's what the generosity of the taxpayer has allowed USAID to do over such a long period of time.
I'd like to turn to sub-Saharan Africa. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the PEPFAR program, which I believe is one of the most successful bipartisan foreign policy accomplishments, which is due for reauthorization this Congress. Can you tell us about USAID's role in implementing PEPFAR and any recommendations you would have for strengthening that program?
Well, let me just commend everybody who's been involved in PEPFAR over the duration of its life. I think the numbers are something like 25 million lives saved or affected. USAID is a major implementer of PEPFAR, along with our colleagues at the State Department and the CDC. Much of our health work in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, and our investments in health systems started through PEPFAR. I would note, to your point about strengthening, I think the commitment that has been made in PEPFAR to work with more local organizations is an incredibly important one. It's a cue that we are trying to take in the rest of our programming at USAID because they have managed in a short period of time to move from funding large international partners to local actors. They have also managed to do government-to-government programs. You know, there was a time when we used to do a lot of support for various ministries, corruption concerns and other concerns led the United States to do less of that. PEPFAR is a place where they've proven that it can be done with safeguards that work. So I think more localization, more of these kinds of investments that can have collateral benefits outside HIV/AIDS prevention. But the fact that so many countries whose life expectancies had plummeted by 10, 20 years when this program started, when President Bush started this program, that those countries are now, you know, living, individuals are living as long or more in some cases than advanced economies and democracies is a tribute to everybody who's been a part of that. But I would say localization, the question of how focus on this single devastating disease can translate into benefits as well in health systems. I think that's where our emphasis is.
Madam
you. My time has
Administrator,
expired.
are you still, General Lady's time has expired. Are you, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 members. And I want to make sure every member has a chance to ask a question. Are you willing to stay a little bit after 5?
Yes, yes. If I
Okay,
could just have a flight, that's my only challenge, but I think we're fine.
I mean, it would probably take us to about 10 after 5, maybe.
That's fine. Absolutely.
But I'm gonna keep y'all at 5 minutes, so we can, you know, I'll be very disciplined in my time. Chair recognizes Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. Ma'am, you're familiar with the term Gender Integration Technical Assistance Task Orders?
I don't think I am.
It's reports. I've read a number of them from Ghana, Kenya, Serbia, Niger, Laos, other countries. In reading a number of these reports and looking at the funding levels for them, most of them are around 70, 80 pages. Some of them may be close to 100 pages. Most of that I read ultimately through a company named Banyan Global. I'm not specifically familiar with it, but that just happened to be the name of the company that was tasked to do them. And to the tunes of millions of dollars for these reports. One on Serbia, roughly $12 million. One on Ghana, Kenya, Serbia, part 1 for $4,351,644. Another one, $7,295,806. Niger and Laos, $12,295,733. And my question really is this: that seems like an astronomical number for 70, 80, 90, 100-page reports. Can you explain that?
I think for me, it's something that I would just have to look at what you're looking at. Happy to follow up. Again, it's very hard for me to speculate. I'm looking to see if I have some.
From your position leading USAID, these are directly through USAID.
No,
I would
completely understand. But the idea of an $80 million report, doesn't sound right. And given the prior exchange,
it doesn't sound right to me either. But we're not just talking about one for $8 million. Like I said, we're talking about $4 million plus, $7 million plus, $11 million plus, $12 million plus, parts 1.
I'm happy to take. On the particulars again. I'd be happy to engage with you.
That would be pretty important, especially in a budget hearing like this. I
we
want to talk about one of those specifically as it relates to Serbia. It resulted in a funding request providing up to $2 million. This is it in front of me, and it's specifically advancing equity and equality for marginalized groups for activities in Serbia. Specifically promoting empowerment of transgender, queer, intersex, lesbian, and gay people in Serbia. And then more specifically, it asks for experimental approaches to advance social and economic well-being of the aforementioned. Can you tell me what we are spending $2 million in experimental approaches to advance social and economic well-being of transgender, queer, intersex, lesbian, gay, bisexual? And I would just go on to say this, it's been spoken about where we are seceding the high ground and where China and Russia are making advances around the globe. Your agency is forcing gender identity on countries. And that's neither soft power nor hard power. It's simply weakening for the United States of America. But I would like to know about that $2 million, please.
So I was just in Serbia, as it happens, last week. Notwithstanding that, I'm not familiar with the program, and I'll have to get back to you. The characterization of us foisting ideology on this country, that country, is false.
It's entirely accurate. I mean,
I'd be
it's
happy
literally
to, if you would like to.
promoting
No, if you-
equity and
that's not what
economic
happens.
empowerment of transgender, queer, intersex,
there
lesbian,
is-
gay, bisexual, through innovative and experimental approaches to advance the social and economic well-being of the aforementioned people in Serbia. So I'm not making up words. I'm not inserting them into your mouth or the agency. I am reading to you directly, which I will ask. Can I submit this for the record, Mr. Chairman?
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I'm not mischaracterizing anything. It's $2 million exactly for that, and this isn't the first time. Other people have brought up drag shows in Ecuador, things like that. The things going on within state are absolutely forcing gender identity on other countries. And if anything, this should be considered weakening to the sexes, to women, to advance somebody because of how they are identifying instead of because of their biological sex should be considered a form of disempowering women. I want to ask you one other question with my remaining time. Within USAID, would you consider gender dysphoria a qualifier for employment or a disqualifier for employment?
I'm not able to answer that. Sorry.
Let's try again. Would you consider gender dysphoria a qualifier for employment or a disqualifier for employment within USAID?
Again, I'm not going to comment. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today, Administrator Powers. I represent Arizona, a border state that benefits tremendously from a strong working relationship with our neighbors in Mexico, Central, and Latin America. But we are struggling to process an increasing number of asylum seekers, particularly from countries in the Northern Triangle. These migrants are fleeing poverty, corruption, human rights abuses, persecution, and violence fueled by narco-trafficking. And they seek to find safety and economic opportunity here in the United States. It's critical that the United States tackles the underlying factors driving this migration so that families are far less likely to make the dangerous journey north. 2 weeks ago, this committee marked up my bill, H.R. 2789, the American Cooperation with Our Neighbors Act, which instructs the State Department and USAID to strategize with local partners, including law enforcement and local governments on both sides of the border, to combat fentanyl trafficking throughout our region, one of the largest drivers of violence and corruption. But while fighting narco-trafficking in the region is key, we must also work to create economic opportunity and to use every diplomatic tool to stop democratic backsliding in the region. Congress should provide strategic long-term support focused on building security and opportunity in Latin America. Administrator Powers, the State Department started implementing the U.S. strategy for addressing the root causes of migration in Central America in 2021. From your perspective, what parts of the strategy have worked well and what parts have not worked so well?
Thank you so much. And thank you for your knowledge of and commitment to addressing root causes. And as you say, when people are on the move in these numbers, it is a symptom of things that are badly broken in their communities, because if you engage these people, the last thing they want to do is leave their homes. It's something none of us would wish to do, but physical insecurity or economic despair has been a major factor. To your question very specifically, I think we have, USAID has made for the first time a real investment in lawful pathways, in labor pathways, and with very modest resources have strengthened the capacity in the labor ministries and in El Salvador, the foreign ministry, to process people who come to the United States on seasonal work visas, the H-2B program, doubling our numbers, and I think those numbers can go up in the H-2A in the agricultural sector as well. That is outsized in its impact because there's the people who benefit from the program, the resources they bring back to their home country. If they overstay, they are no longer eligible, and indeed the country is at risk of not being eligible. So there's strict compliance with that program. But also, if people believe that they can come seasonally, then they get the best of both worlds of being able to come to the United States and earn money if they haven't been able to at home, but also coming back and be with their families. I think something like that has been very effective. Obviously on governance, the trend lines speak for themselves. They're going in the wrong direction across the board in terms of treatment of independent media, in terms of judicial institutions, which are meant to be stewards of Guatemalan, Honduran, Salvadoran resources, but themselves, falling prey to political influence. We have had to reroute resources that had been invested in government judicial programs in Guatemala and in El Salvador to civil society organizations that are holding the governments accountable. So the governance trend lines in the region are very worrying.
Thank you very much, Administrator. The People's Republic of China is increasing its investments in Mexico and Central America, particularly in the energy and telecommunication industries. This has serious implications for United States national interests. In addition, Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras have all severed longstanding ties with Taiwan in the last few years in favor of strengthening their relationship with Beijing. Does the PRC pose a threat to a free and open Latin America, and how is USAID responding to those challenges?
Well, you haven't touched upon the Caribbean, but one way is significantly, alongside the rest of the administrations, significantly increasing our presence in, our programming in, or at least appealing for resources to be able to do that in the Caribbean, which is really has been very susceptible. I think what DFC is doing with support from USAID field teams on the ground is really important. And then taking advantage of democratic openings or anti-corruption openings like that in the Dominican Republic to channel support, to support nearshoring, which will provide economic livelihoods there, make us less susceptible to shocks and so forth. So there's a lot one can say country by country, but bottom line, to support economic programming, to support democracy and governance, and to always remember our comparative advantages alongside PRC investments.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you.
Mr. Burchant's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The mission of USAID is to promote and demonstrate democratic values abroad. So, ma'am, why does USAID think taxpayers should pay for a study on the intersection of gender equity and climate conflict?
I'm going to have to do, I'm sorry I keep doing this, but I want to know more than the headline.
Well, ma'am, it's in your,
program.
it's in your
Maybe, but there's a lot,
literature.
we have a lot of literature and a lot of programs.
Yes,
So
ma'am, but
if we could follow
knowing
up on
that
the
you're coming up here to
specifics.
discuss this and knowing that at least my side of the aisle might be concerned about some of these things, it just seems that you all should be more prepared for this type of thing. USAID seems, they think we need to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and net zero development. Why net zero development? It seems like more development, agriculture areas, people would be able to feed themselves more. So explain to that to me, ma'am.
Well, I think we all have a responsibility to do what we can to try to limit the amount of warming that is going to occur, given the devastation that the current level of warming is wreaking not only globally, but also here in the United States, as farmers can attest, and as anybody who's experienced one of the ever-growing number of natural disasters can attest. But putting that to one side, actually in this instance, even though there's a perception among some that we are foisting our values on others globally, the demand signal we are getting from the countries, the governments, the leaders that we engage as we think through what our broad agendas should be, is that is where they want to go. They also know that renewables prices are coming way down, that they can leapfrog other stages of electrification more easily with solar and wind.
But stop for a second, ma'am. Leapfrog, say that again, and what does that mean?
Oh, thank you. Sorry, jargony maybe, but in many of the communities we work, you can imagine there's no electricity. It can be very, very expensive and very hard to connect individuals with whom we are working to grids, which may in fact use, be powered by non-renewable sources of energy. But regardless, we can't get them to the grids because it's too expensive, too hard. However, you can pop up a solar panel and electrify an entire health clinic or an entire school system or university.
Well, I would suggest you,
in a
ma'am, it
heartbeat.
take more than just a solar panel to do that.
But what I mean, you get the point. My point is we have been able to do off-grid electrification that we never would have thought possible 10 or 15 years ago through Power Africa and other initiatives.
Is it really necessary for, and this is in quotes, the most vulnerable populations to be focused on a net zero climate development pathway when their populations are struggling to find food?
I promise you that the people who work at USAID in the field, 2/3 of our staff are nationals of the countries in which we work, care about the poverty in which communities are living, and that is the animating emphasis of their work and of their problem solving. As it happens, they're also watching climate havoc drive people into poverty who were not in poverty even just 5 years ago because of natural disaster or because agriculture has dried up, because of drought or because of flooding, too much water, too little water. It's different everywhere, but that is a factor as to how we design our programming is listening to the needs of the communities in which we work, which starts, you're right, with an emphasis on ending poverty. That is the #1 thing that communities, families want to do, but they also, communities even now see the linkage with the changing weather patterns.
Well, ma'am, and I go back to the my original statement that you all are paying for a study on the intersection of gender equity and climate conflict. I do not think that that fits into this. I think it's social engineering. I think that you all come in here to these things and you know your votes and you run the clock and you tell us we'll get back to you on that. And I really would expect you all to get back to us on these things that we've raised. And I would like someone in my office talking to me about the intersection of gender equity and climate conflict. And I really don't think any of these really promote and demonstrate democratic values. I believe they're basically presenting a far-left ideology. And at some point, we'll get to the bottom of this. I appreciate your job, and I know you've got a job to give us the runaround, and that's the deal. And y'all get your check from the taxpayers, but I can assure you not all the taxpayers agree with this agenda. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mrs. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Administrator Power, I am so delighted you are here, admirer of your work and the work of your entire team as you partner with countries around the world. And I want to say at the outset that I do not associate myself with some of the line of questions that you have just received, the very slanted line of questions. And I ask a rhetorical question: do members on the other side of the aisle have no members of their community or of their families who are LGBTQ+? Do they have no one that they know? Because this is certainly not a question of culture, pop culture, whatever kind of dynamics they were talking about. This is a question of humanity. And the business you're in is lifting up humanity. So I wanted you to know I do not associate myself with those questions. We are here about the Biden-Harris budget request for USAID. $32 billion, direct dollars. I support it. I support the work you do. I see the safeguards that you are putting into your programs in the most difficult parts of the world, struggling with poverty and no food, terrorism, and all kinds of problems. While it's a $32 billion request, can you talk to the multiplier that by prevention work, by leveraging these dollars, what the multiplier effect is of $32 billion budgets?
Well, maybe I just use one example. And first of all, thank you for your comments. And I think all questions about our programs are reasonable. It's just challenging when you have thousands of them to be able to know the specifics on any one. So I actually, with sincerity, will get back to people who have questions on specific projects. I'll use the one example of Pakistan, where I traveled after the floods last year. A third of the country was underwater because of heavier monsoon rains than they'd had and melting glaciers, presumably attributable to climate change. And it was, you'd be hundreds of miles inland, and it looked like the ocean if you're in a helicopter going over these communities. Schools devastated, out of use probably forevermore. Health clinics out of use, just underwater. When the water receded, some of the only schools that were ready to be used again as schools once the displaced people moved out of them were USAID-funded schools that had been rebuilt after the last flooding with an eye to prevention, with an eye to what the floods would mean. And this eye as a design feature to disaster-resilient infrastructure of all kinds is just an example of something now our humanitarians are doing much more of in the wake of a hurricane or any kind of natural emergency, or in the wake of conflict when reconstruction occurs. So that's I think just an excellent example that those schools were actually able to withstand floods because they were built to withstand floods.
That's a great example.
So
may I ask you a little bit more?
Please.
Pakistan was on my mind. We were just on Zoom with Pakistani American about his concerns in Pakistan. I have many Pakistani Americans in my district, which is suburban Philadelphia. And you think about what you just described, the current political instability, the economic challenges, inflation over 35%, the severe floods, hunger, food supply issues. Can you speak to what USAID is doing there? And also, I'd like to layer in there China's influence. By one article I read, China's influence there is at one of its highest in terms of malign influence, frankly, whether it is in the domains of technology, foreign policy, military. So a little more on Pakistan. We urgently care.
Yeah, in brief, I would say that I do think showing up at the right time is really important, which is why I and so many of us at USAID try to get out and about and do so when it really matters for people. So when the floods hit last year, announcing, I think initially a $50 million and then $100 million investment in flood response right at the beginning, while other countries, not only our traditional donor partners, but also the country that you mentioned, hang back. I mean, the Pakistani people remember. That's something they'll remember, just as they did the work that we did after the last floods. So those kinds of humanitarian investments, we wish to have to make fewer of those because you don't want to live in a world of too many emergencies, but being the world's largest humanitarian donor is a point of privilege, and I think it really reflects well on the United States. The other kinds of initiatives we're doing are largely catalytic, economic growth, agriculture, female
General's
entrepreneurs.
time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr.
Thank you.
Davidson.
Thank you, Madam.
I thank the chairman. Ms. Power, thanks for sticking around a little bit longer. Under the Biden administration, USAID plans to give $500 million to support the Palestinian people and advance a, quote, two-state solution. However, it's well known that Palestine houses foreign terrorist organizations such as Hamas. Why is this $500 million a good use of American taxpayer dollars?
Well, our goal, of course, is to reach vulnerable communities around the world. We absolutely have to do so in a manner that makes sure that terrorist elements are not getting access to USAID resources. But, we do programming that really looks at what causes somebody to join Hamas in the first place. And a lack of opportunity, a lack of exposure to people from Israel or people from outside of narrow echo chambers, is a factor.
Do you feel like this is promoting peace there, or is it facilitating, further development of the Iron Dome? Because Palestinian territory keeps seeing launches just even recently of rockets directed against Israel. So
yeah, how
do we solve this?
Well, I don't know that in my 3.5 minutes I can tell you how to solve Middle East peace, but I obviously USAID's support for development investments is a very small piece
Are you
of the
confident
broader.
none of it's flowing to illicit use?
I am confident that we have systems in place. When allegations come forward through our Inspector General, through our third-party monitors on the ground. We dig into those allegations. We have had to cut off funding to organizations in the past because something didn't surface in a vet and then came forward. But we are absolutely determined, again, to make sure, given the complexity of the environment, it's not an easy place to work. It's not an easy place to work.
It'd be an easy place not to spend $500 million. Turning to Ukraine and Russia. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the U.S. has committed nearly $23 billion in direct budget support through USAID
specifically to support the Ukrainian government. This is for Ukraine's government to operate. These tax dollars, the American tax dollars, fund a variety of things, including pensions for Ukrainian people. Why should U.S. taxpayer dollars foot the bill for pensions in any other country but Ukraine when we have our own pension shortfalls here at home? So we're looking at budget priorities, and not like we're flush with cash. The only way to pay our bills is to borrow more money ourselves. Why should we borrow money to pay for Ukrainian pensions?
Well, it's a very fair question. I think in general, stepping back from that particular, but I will come right back to that, the Ukrainian government is running a $5 billion budget deficit every month. Part of what its budget goes for, as here, is to take care of vulnerable elderly people.
There's vulnerable people all over the world. And frankly, people very vulnerable in war zones. Why are we paying to operate the Ukrainian government?
Well, we are the world's largest humanitarian donor, well and apart from Ukraine. So we are invested in helping vulnerable people. That's part of what the United States does around the world.
I think that's a lot of money that we shouldn't be spending.
No, we're not. We're not spending that money on pension.
It's a non-answer.
No, it's not a non-answer.
So let's move on.
No, you're mischaracterizing what we're doing. We are not spending those sums of money on pension.
We're paying to operate
I
the
understand
government
that's
of
a
Ukraine.
subset. We're also paying for
We're paying
generators.
for a whole lot. There's $113 billion. I didn't ask you about the other money. I asked you about the money we're paying to operate Ukraine's
I thought you had a concern specifically about pensioners. That's a very small subset of broader support, because the greatest gift to Putin that we could give is to have the lights go out on the Ukrainian government, to have Ukraine collapse, not for reasons of missiles, but because they can't actually support people in need.
All right. Let's go to another topic. It's been touched on by a number of my colleagues, but, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion's got a great sounding ring to it, but the equity part in particular has got a lot of concerns. It's really a socialist redistribution. It's not meant as a salve to heal old wounds. It's meant to divide people. And in particular, last year, USAID wrote its gender policy to redefine gender as a social construct that can be self-determined. These new definitions open the category of women to anyone, including men who identify as women. Today, USAID boasts a network of over 200 gender advisors. Many countries find this abhorrent, but the administration continues to fund these policies in countries where our policies aren't in line. They're creating tension instead of facilitating things. Why?
Our approach has been broadly caricatured, including, I think, in this exchange, unfortunately.
My time's expired, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Honorable Administrator Samantha Powers, I want to say I'm a true admirer of your work and the good things that you do. I've had the opportunity to go to Kenya and see the front lines of the climate change. So continued success in the work that you do and the enormous crisis that you're confronting around the world. And at this time, I'd like to yield my time to my colleague, Congresswoman Kamlager-Dove.
Thank you for that. I just have to share with you, Administrator, some of the things that I've heard in this committee, that Mexico is a disease, that Africa is full of failed states, that Afghanistan is a nation of tribes, and that there's violence all over there. In Africa, for me, there's just too much hegemonic patriarchal invective coming from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. The most dangerous disease is not tuberculosis, it's anti-democratic mob rule, which I think was catalyzed by our former president, a xenophobe, a white supremacist sympathizer, an agitator, someone who disobeyed the law, raged about being able to shoot people and assault women. He was the ultimate migraine. If people are deprived and indignified, they resort to bad options, the only bad options that generally tend to be on the table, and those options have the power to corrupt freedom and democracy. I see USAID as helping to create better options all over the world, especially for women and girls. I, too, recently came back from Kenya and looked at the devastation that's there because of climate change, and also had very sobering discussions about gender-based violence, female genital mutilation. There are 150 million more women and girls that are going hungry than men and women. And so I will yield the balance of my time because we don't have any more, but I'm very interested in what USAID is doing to help address and leverage the issue, doing around the issues of women and girls that are suffering from gender-based violence in Latin America, but also across the continent of Africa, and how else we can stay engaged.
Thank you so much. You know, I think one of the reasons I'm troubled by the caricaturing of our programming, the mischaracterization of it, but also the cherry picking and then redefinition of it, is it misses out, that those exchanges miss out on the opportunity to talk about how to do really hard things when it comes to gender empowerment, and it certainly misses out on the opportunity to talk about the very real threats that women and girls face, that LGBTQI plus people face, and it misses out on the opportunity to celebrate the U.S. standing with the underdog and standing with communities that deserve an equal shake. You know, nothing more, nothing less. That's not what women and girls are asking for, just a shot. And gender-based violence is a prime example of something that stands in the way of getting that shot. So it is, you know, it depends country by country how much resources we have to invest. It's been a big area of focus in Central America, shifting norms as well, which could easily be caricatured, but, you know, shifting norms away from thinking it's okay in a society, that it's a sign of masculinity to beat up your spouse. You know, we have programs that do that. You know, how they're titled and how they could be caricatured, but those make a meaningful difference if it gives a community, and particularly men in a community, the courage to stand up and contest norms that end up being destructive, not only for women, but for society's progress. And so much of our gender work and our gender integration is rooted also in acknowledging the economic development payoff of women actually having equal opportunity and not being subjected to barriers like gender-based violence.
Thank you. I yield back my time to the Congressman.
I yield my time to the chairman. Thank you.
No, thank you. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Issa is recognized.
Thank you. Administrator, I'm pretty sure I'm the last. So maybe second last. So last on this side. So take a deep breath, relax. You've rationed the water properly. You've made it. I'm taking a little bit of what's left. So I apologize for not having my good questions you were hoping for. But one question that I have that apparently hasn't been asked. You're familiar with the organization EcoHealth Alliance? And you're still funding them, that's correct? About $8 million or more?
Tell me when you're ready, and I can get into the modalities of our. We fund them in a part of Africa to do forest conservation.
How do we protect this organization that was part of the cover-up of Fauci's operation with the Wuhan laboratory? How do we justify that the head of that organization has, in fact, been part of the cover-up, lied about it? How do we not say, you know, your work is real important, but you got to hand it off to somebody else where we can trust the management?
This is there's a broader question about EcoHealth Alliance that I think you probably have for other agencies that are working in domains perhaps similar to the one that causes us all so much concern in the past.
But it's about trust. You disqualify organizations regularly for what they do in a number of places. So, you know,
the award was the award was granted in October of 2021. It was an open procurement, open competition, the usual rigorous process. Our team in Liberia, which is where this grant is given, and again, it's to a local, you know, group of individuals who are helping train park rangers. You know, they went to the SAM database. They looked at all of the vetting, you know, that we normally do, and so. And the program itself has been impactful, and we haven't had issues along the lines.
Would it be fair to say that you might make a different decision today than you made back then, and this is his legacy?
I'm not going to speculate because I also can't get involved in procurement decisions for all the right reasons, because you want to, you know, prevent political interference of that nature. But certainly, we want to make sure that what we are. That the integrity of the organization is foolproof, and so we want checks and balances.
Administrator, I only want you to speak on behalf of the broad question of you know, I'll phrase it in a way that might be fairer. If an organization anywhere in the world, but particularly one based out of the United States, but anywhere in the world, if an organization is involved in what appears to be false information to a government agency, and especially ours, your organization, not you personally, but your organization has an obligation, and I assume takes it seriously, to include that in the vetting process. Is that fair?
Yes, I think so. I just, on this, I would have a very hard time, because I'm answering generalizable questions, but I don't know if the predicates
we're not
align with the facts.
necessarily talking any longer about that. We're talking
Okay.
about that's an obligation. Now I have one that's left. You know, at $32 billion, we could make you a full-fledged cabinet officer, and you would not be underfunded compared to some cabinet positions. It's a lot of money, and it's fair to say that you control a lot of money. We have at least alleged that there's about a 30% savings if, instead of using U.S. companies that apply for grants, if to the greatest extent possible you regionalize the NGOs, you regionalize the procurement. Now, I know that's not always popular, and as a matter of fact, some years ago I remember on behalf of almonds and raisins, I made the question of, well, just because it costs more, why aren't we sending almonds and raisins from California? But leaving aside the politics that we're responsible for, would you opine on how, with a limited budget, millions or billions of dollars could be better spent if you were allowed to and encouraged to and able to regionalize to the areas that you're helping, or to the nearshore areas of those, both for saving money, but also for helping with the economy? And I know that's not easy to say when American taxpayers are wanting you to buy American goods, but would you opine on that? Because I'd like to hear how you view and what you'd like to do.
I think I don't have much time, but it's an area of great interest to me. I think that you could look at cost effectiveness along the lines of what you're describing in two ways. One is just, is it cheaper to work with a local organization or to regionalize? The other is, do you yield more sustainable development outcomes so it ends up being a better investment over time because the people that you're investing in are from the countries and then carry the work forward even when the grant dries up or the contract dries up. So we have a localization agenda. We're trying to get to 25% of our assistance by 2025. It's incredibly important. We are also trying to figure out whether there are savings that can be accrued by having, for example, contracting officers in a hub in Pakistan who can provide contracting support, if there's a surge of need in Sudan. These kinds of savings, I feel it's incumbent on us to find, not because we have too much money, but because the resources that we need, both with the PRC geopolitical dimension in mind, but also just because of the needs out in the world and the demands that the world is placing on us, we need to be able to say that we are using them optimally. So we are moving in that direction, but there are challenges.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's time
Chairman.
has expired. Mr. Schneider is recognized, and we're going to wrap this up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be brief just because I know we have votes called, and Administrator, you've been here a very long time, so thank you. A long time ago when this hearing started, you talked about a stark view of the world and some of the challenges we face around the world, debt disasters, natural disasters, threats to democracy. You also talked about some of the remarkable things the United States has done through our aid and development programs, reducing poverty, addressing hunger, providing housing, healthcare, education, opportunity, hope around the world, and making a difference. If I link the two things, and you have as you're in the conversations here, we spend more than any other nation, direct dollars on defense and security. We spend a greater share of our budget than other nations on defense and security. If we didn't have the investment we make in aid and development, how much, I don't want to say how much more, in a sense, just scale-wise, what would happen to our needs from a security standpoint?
Well, I presume, it's hard to quantify, but you would see people lacking economic opportunity turning to those who can provide it, and whether that's a militia, a Russian-sponsored militia in a place who's hiring locals, or an extremist organization. You would also see a major cost for American companies. I mean, these are markets for our goods, and so as we enhance economic growth and livelihoods or prevent disease, those are consumers as well. And we've seen U.S. economic growth ride emerging markets and this new consumer base. We're doing an awful lot and want to do a lot more in trade facilitation. These are the kinds of catalytic investments that don't cost much money in the regulatory environment that make trade with the United States easier, but also make American companies better able to invest in these communities. And then just at a human level, the number of people who wouldn't be alive if humanitarian assistance were scaled back, the number of infants who suffer severe and acute malnutrition, who we provide ready-to-use therapeutic feeding to, it brings them back to life. I mean, that's a privilege for the United States to be a part of that kind of work.
So, long story made short, and I'll wrap up. The money we invest in foreign aid and development, the soft power that the United States projects around the world, multiplies and amplifies our hard power. It makes it easier for us to lead economically and supports our companies as they do work around the globe. It makes us a stronger country, and at the same time, to quote Ronald Reagan, he called the United States that shining light on the hill. It puts us in a place to be the country that other countries look up to, that citizens around the world look towards for relief. So I just want to say thank you for your work. Thank you for your patience in staying here and giving me the chance to sing the praises of USAID. But just as important, all the people who work in USAID and the services they provide to our nation, on behalf of our nation, helping others around the world. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Well, Administrator, you made it. Thank you for staying a little later. But we do appreciate, let me just say this as the chairman of this committee.
I thought I was the chairman.
Well, you were for about a couple seconds. I just personally want to thank you for your service to our country, from both sides of the aisle. And we know how hard your job is and how important your job is, and we support you in your efforts. And I know you're embarking to go to Sudan, and we appreciate you doing that. Very dangerous, and please be careful while you're over there, and give us a call when you get back. I'd love to get a report on that. And again, thanks for your service to our great country. And
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And with that, pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials. For the record, without objection, committee stands adjourned.